Hello everyone. Welcome back to another scary story, your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes, relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. Have you ever noticed how a hospital feels different at night? During the day, it's a place of beeping machines, rushing doctors, and visitors carrying flowers. But when the sun goes down, when the hallways empty and the world outside fades into quiet, something changes. The air feels thicker. The lights seem dimmer, even when they're at full brightness. And the silence, God. The silence isn't peaceful. It presses in, waiting, watching. I'm a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Have been for a few months now. People always say it's the hardest shift, that it wears you down in ways you don't expect. They're right. You stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a ghost, floating through dimly lit corridors while the rest of the world sleeps. It was a slow night, the kind that made my eyelids heavy and my mind wander. I was refilling charts at the nurses' station, trying to ignore the flickering light overhead. We reported it to maintenance weeks ago, but they never got around to fixing it. It was always like that in hospitals, so much life and death happening all the time that the little things just got forgotten. Then I heard it. A sound from down the hall. Not a normal hospital sound. Not the rustle of bed sheets or the distant hum of an IV pump. This was different. A wet, dragging sound. I sat up, my heart thudding a little faster. The security cameras at the desk showed nothing unusual. Just empty hallways, the occasional patient shifting in bed. But that sound. God, it made my skin crawl. I stood, my nursing shoes silent against the cold tile as I moved toward the hallway. The sound had stopped. And then, a scream. High-pitched, raw, and desperate. It came from room 13. That stopped me in my tracks. Because room 13 was empty. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the pen in my hand like it could protect me. Just nerves, I told myself. Just an old hospital playing tricks on a sleep-deprived mind. But I had to check. I reached the door, my breath catching in my throat. The plaque beside it read, Room 13. In faded gold lettering, the edges worn from years of cleaning. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for darkness to spill out like ink onto the hallway floor. I pushed it open. The bed was soaked in blood. My stomach lurched. The metallic scent hit me like a brick, thick and suffocating. The sheets were ruined, stained deep crimson, and the floor. Jesus, the floor was wet. Like someone had been standing there, bleeding. But the room was empty. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step inside. The overhead light flickered, barely holding back the shadows. My fingers trembled as I reached for the call button, but when I pressed it, nothing. No beep. No response from the nurse's station. The intercom was dead. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a prank. Maybe some weird maintenance issue. But then, the blood moved. Not like a drip, not like a spill soaking deeper into the mattress. It moved. Pulled itself toward the edge of the bed, like something unseen was drinking it in. I staggered back, my pulse hammering, and then the overhead light went out. Total darkness. I turned, fumbling for the hallway light, for anything, but then, cold fingers closed around my wrist. A voice, right next to my ear. A whisper, rasping and broken. "They're coming. I spun around. The patient was right there. A man, thin and pale, wearing a hospital gown soaked in blood. His eyes, God, his eyes were black. Not just dark, not just shadowed. Black, like ink, like nothingness, swallowing all the light in the room. And his mouth, it was sewn shut. I choked on a scream, jerking back, my shoes slipping on the wet floor. Then, nothing. The lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The bed was clean. No blood. No patient. No sign that anything had just happened. I stumbled back into the hallway, my chest heaving, my mind screaming at me to run, run, run. But I didn't, because I saw something else. Down the hall at the nurse's station, the security monitor flickered. The camera feed for room 13 was frozen, static hissing across the screen. And in the middle of it, in the grainy, flickering image, I saw myself, standing in the empty room, with something behind me, something smiling. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my breath locked in my chest as I stared at the security monitor, at the grainy, flickering image of myself standing in room 13. But that wasn't the part that made my skin crawl, that made my stomach twist into knots so tight I thought I might be sick. It was what stood behind me in the footage. Something tall, something wrong, something that shouldn't be there at all. The figure loomed in the dimly lit room, its shape distorted by the static of the camera feed. I could barely make out any features, just an outline. But the one thing I could see, the one thing I couldn't look away from, was its mouth. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across its face, too large, too sharp, like it wasn't smiling because it was happy, but because it had found something to devour. I turned, heart hammering, expecting to see it standing right there, just inches away from me, its breath on my neck. But the hallway was empty. Room 13 was empty. The hospital was silent except for the distant hum of machines and the low buzz of the overhead lights. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing, trying to remind myself that cameras glitch all the time, that I was just overtired, that I'd probably imagined the blood, the patient, the voice whispering in my ear. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. I reached for the phone on the nurse's station, needing to call security, to call anyone. But when I pressed it to my ear, there was nothing. No dial tone, just static. The same sound hissing from the security monitor. My fingers tightened around the receiver as a cold wave of fear washed over me. This wasn't normal. Phones didn't just go out like this. All at once. I hung up, picked it up again. Still nothing. I tried the intercom, pressing the button hard enough to make my knuckles ache. Silence. I swallowed, my throat dry, my mind racing for a rational explanation. But the list of logical reasons was growing shorter by the second. I turned back to the monitor, needing to see if the camera was still frozen, if that thing was still there. But now the screen was completely black. The feed was gone. I wasn't alone. I felt. Before I heard anything, a weight in the air, pressing against my skin, against my chest, like the whole hospital was holding its breath. The flickering overhead light cast long, uneven shadows across the walls, making everything look twisted, distorted. I could hear the faint hum of the vending machine at the end of the hall, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor from a patient's room nearby. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but underneath them, buried just beneath the surface, was something else. A whisper. Not words. Not yet. just the soft, rustling sound of something moving, something breathing. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, toward the darkened corridor leading deeper into the hospital. My fingers dug into the edge of the counter as I strained to see into the shadows, my pulse thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The lights flickered again just for a second, but in that brief moment of darkness I saw them, a row of figures standing in the hallway, motionless, silent. Their hospital gowns were stained, their faces were pale, their eyes, God, their eyes were black, just like the man in room 13, just like the thing on the monitor, and they were staring at me. The light buzzed back to life, and they were gone. I stumbled back, my hip colliding with the edge of the desk. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my vision swimming as my brain fought to process what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Had the flickering lights played tricks on my mind? Or were they still there, just out of sight, standing in the dark? I needed to leave. Now. I spun on my heel, moving toward the exit at the end of the hallway, trying to convince myself that this was just exhaustion messing with my head, that I had been working too many shifts, too many hours, and my brain was turning the shadows into monsters. But as I reached the elevator, my stomach dropped. The button panel was dark. I pressed the call button once, twice. Nothing. No chime, no soft glow of the button lighting up. Just a dead, lifeless machine. Panic clawed at my chest. I turned to the stairwell door, gripping the handle and pushing hard. It didn't budge. Locked. I was trapped. My breath hitched as I stumbled back, staring at the unyielding door, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The elevators were down, the stairwell was locked, the phones were dead. There was no way out. A sound broke the silence. A slow, rhythmic tapping. I turned, my muscles locking as the noise grew louder, closer. It was coming from down the hall, from room 13. My mouth went dry as I stepped backward, the tapping continuing, steady, deliberate. A sharp, metallic sound, like nails against glass. I didn't want to go back. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run, to find another way out. But the rational part of my brain, the nurse in me, the part trained to bow, check, confirm, document, wouldn't let me ignore it. I took a shaky breath and forced my feet to move. The hallway stretched ahead of me, impossibly long, the walls seeming to close in with every step. The air was thick, heavy, like I was walking through something unseen. I reached the door to room 13. The tapping had stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then a soft, wet sound, like something dragging across the floor. I reached for the door handle with a trembling hand, pressing my palm against the cool metal. My skin prickled, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to forget about this, to pretend none of it had happened. But it was too late for that. I pushed the door open. The room was dark. The only light came from the window, pale moonlight casting long shadows across the bed, across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing by the bed. Their back was turned to me, their hospital gown hanging loose over thin, bony shoulders. Their arms hung at their sides, limp, unmoving. I swallowed hard, taking a cautious step inside. "Sir?" My voice came out quieter than I intended, barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my fingers tightening around the small flashlight clipped to my pocket. I hesitated, then reached out, just inches from their shoulder. Then, the lights flickered, and the figure turned. Their face, God, their face. Their eyes were black pits, their mouths sewn shut with thick, uneven stitches, but they were still smiling. Their heads tilted slowly, almost curiously, as if they were studying me. Then their lips split apart at the seams. The stitches snapped one by one, and they screamed. The scream that tore from the patient's mouth was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just loud. It wasn't just painful. It was wrong. It didn't sound like something a human throat should be capable of producing. A raw, guttural wail that seemed to stretch and twist the very air around it, filling every corner of the room, vibrating through the floor, through my bones, through my skull, rattling inside my brain like it was trying to get in. I stumbled backward, my ears ringing, my vision blurring as the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen and pulse with the sound, the bed frame shaking, the IV pole rattling, the very walls trembling, as if the entire hospital was trying to pull away from whatever horror had just been unleashed. The patient's mouth hung open wide, wider than should have been possible, the last of the black stitches dangling from torn flesh, his jaw unhinging as the scream grew. The force of it pushing against me like a wave, like something with weight, with shape, pressing me back toward the door, even though I couldn't move. My muscles locked in place, my body refusing to obey as my mind screamed at me to run, run, run. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The patient's mouth slowly closed, his jaw clicking back into place, his lips curling into something that was neither a grin nor a grimace, but something between, something unreadable, something that made my stomach twist in knots because it wasn't relief, it wasn't pain, it wasn't anything I could name, and that made it terrifying. His black eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he spoke. The words didn't come from his mouth. His lips didn't move. The sound came from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. A voice so layered, so fragmented, like a dozen people speaking at once, some whispering, some laughing, some crying. They are coming. The lights exploded. Glass rained down as the bulbs shattered, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the pale glow of the heart monitor screen flickering erratically, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the floor, across the patient's still form, across something else, something behind him, something rising, something tall. I didn't think. I ran. I slammed into the doorframe, pain jolting through my shoulder, my hands fumbling for balance as I stumbled into the hallway. The air colder, the silence thicker. My breath coming in ragged gasps as I turned back, expecting to see him still standing there. But the room was empty. The bed was untouched, and the heart monitor was beeping. I stood frozen just outside the doorway, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps as I stared into the now empty room, my brain struggling to piece together what I had just seen, what I had just heard, what had just happened in front of me. The patient was gone. The shattered glass from the overhead light was gone. The rattling bed frame and the shaking walls were gone, as if none of it had ever happened, as if the scream that had torn through the very foundation of this place had been nothing more than a bad dream, a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by too many night shifts and too little sleep. But the one thing that hadn't disappeared, the one thing that still remained, was the sound. The heart monitor was still beeping. It was slow, steady, rhythmic, just like any normal monitor would sound if a living patient were lying in the bed, hooked up to wires and electrodes, their heartbeat sending tiny electronic pulses through the machine, confirming that they were still breathing, still alive. But there was no one there. The bed was empty. The wires were untouched. There was no movement, no shifting sheets, No sign of life at all, and yet the sound continued, soft but insistent, a quiet pulse in the darkness, filling the silence that had swallowed the hospital whole. I took a step back, my body shaking, my skin cold despite the warmth of the overhead lights that still flickered weakly in the hallway, my mind screaming at me to get out now. But my feet wouldn't move fast enough, my legs heavy, sluggish, as if something unseen had wrapped itself around my ankles, rooting me to the floor, forcing me to stay, to listen. The beeping changed. It grew faster. I watched as the small green line on the monitor screen spiked, then dipped, then spiked again. Erratic now. No longer steady, no longer calm, the sound following suit, quickening, tightening, racing. As if something unseen had just woken up, as if something just beyond my vision had just become aware that I was there, watching, listening, waiting. Then the sound stopped. No long, drawn-out fading, no soft descent into silence. It cut off instantly, abruptly, as if someone had ripped the power cord from the wall, as if the machine itself had never been on in the first place, as if it had only been making noise for one reason: to get my attention. And it had worked. The room remained empty. The air remained still. The hospital remained silent. But I knew I wasn't alone. And then, from somewhere down the hall, so faint it was almost impossible to hear, came something new. A heartbeat. Not from a machine. A real one. Coming closer. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to keep staring at the empty hospital bed, to pretend I hadn't heard the sound at all. Because if I acknowledged it, if I so much as twitched in response, then whatever was out there would know that I had heard it, that I had noticed, that I was aware of its presence. And I couldn't shake the feeling that knowing was the worst thing I could possibly do. But the heartbeat continued, slow and heavy. A deep, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from somewhere in the hallway behind me. Steady and real and wrong. Because it wasn't coming from a machine. It wasn't the soft, mechanical beeping of a heart monitor. It was the sound of a living, beating heart, and it was getting closer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my fingers twitching at my sides as I fought the rising panic creeping up my spine, the cold sweat forming along the back of my neck, the overwhelming certainty that if I turned around, if I looked toward the source of that sound, I would see something I wasn't supposed to see, something I couldn't unsee. But I couldn't just stand there forever. The air in the hallway felt thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like invisible hands, and my lungs ached from holding my breath for too long, from the fear of making even the slightest sound, as if the act of breathing itself might draw it closer. Then the heartbeat changed. It wasn't alone anymore. Another one joined it, then another, then another. Soft at first, but growing louder, overlapping, a chorus of heartbeats thudding in the darkness, all of them in sync, all of them surrounding me, pressing in from all sides, echoing off the walls, vibrating through the floor, so many that I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore, if they were behind me, beside me, above me. Then, cutting through the rhythmic thudding, came a different sound, a sound far worse than all the heartbeats combined. Footsteps. Soft at first, hesitant, deliberate, then faster, then running, coming straight for me. I turned. I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. But my body moved before I could stop it, my head snapping toward the hallway, my breath catching in my throat, my pulse slamming against my ribs as my eyes locked onto the far end of the corridor, where the fluorescent lights buzz weakly, flickering, casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still coming fast, coming straight toward me. But there was no one there. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and bolt down the hallway, to throw myself against the locked stairwell door, to pound my fists against it until someone heard me, until someone let me out, until I was anywhere but here. But my legs wouldn't move. My feet felt glued to the cold tile floor, my body frozen in place as the invisible footsteps came closer, faster, hammering against the silence, closing the distance between me and whatever was chasing me. The air in the hallway shifted, a sudden pressure change that made my ears pop, that made the hair on my arms stand on end. A sensation like standing too close to an open elevator shaft. That feeling of space, of something vast and waiting, something hungry. My breath hitched in my throat, shallow and panicked, my lungs refusing to take in enough air, because even though my eyes told me that there was nothing in front of me, that the hallway was just as empty as it had been before, that the walls and the flickering lights and the peeling linoleum floor hadn't changed. My body knew better. Something was there, and then it breathed. A slow, shuddering inhale, pulling the air from the hallway, from my lungs, making the world around me feel thinner, weaker, like the space itself was unraveling, like the walls weren't real anymore, like if I reached out I would feel nothing but empty air and a presence pressing closer, close enough that I could feel it without seeing it, close enough that if I moved, if I spoke, if I so much as blinked, it would touch me. The lights flickered, and for a fraction of a second I saw it. Not clearly, not in a way my brain could fully process, but enough. A shape, taller than me, taller than the doorways, too tall. Its limbs long and thin, its body wrapped in something dark, not fabric, not flesh, but something that shifted. Something that moved like it was alive, something that swallowed the light around it, pulling the shadows into itself like a wound that never stopped bleeding. The lights flickered again, and it was gone. But it was closer now. I did the only thing I could think to do. I moved. My feet felt like they were pushing through water, every step sluggish, my muscles slow to respond, as if the space around me was trying to hold me in place, as if whatever had been breathing in the dark wanted me to stay. I forced myself forward, my hand outstretched, reaching for the edge of the nurse's station, for something solid, something real, my fingers grazing the counter just as the lights went out completely. And in the darkness, I felt something cold brush against my arm. And then it spoke my name. Hearing my name in that voice, in that layered, fragmented whisper that sounded like 100 different mouths speaking at once, each one just slightly out of sync with the others, was worse than seeing the thing itself. The moment the sound reached me, slithering into my ears, pressing against the inside of my skull like something trying to burrow deeper, I knew that whatever had been lurking in the shadows, whatever had been watching me, from the moment I stepped into room 13, had finally decided to claim me. I tried to move, to jerk away, to pull myself back, but the air was thick now, pressing against my limbs, against my chest, against my throat, suffocating and invisible, a weight that wasn't touching me, but still holding me in place. My fingers twitched uselessly at my sides, my legs refused to step forward, and I could feel it behind me, inches away, could feel the space where it stood shifting, warping, the air colder and thinner, like it was drinking in the warmth, the life, the very reality around me. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. The hallway gone, the walls gone, the hospital itself feeling more and more like an illusion, like I had already stepped somewhere else, somewhere beneath the real world, somewhere where nothing lived except it. And then the lights came back. Not slowly, not in flickering bursts, just on, all at once, as if they had never gone out at all. The hallway was empty. The nurse's station was just as I had left it, with the computer monitor glowing softly, the paperwork neatly stacked beside it, the security feed flickering through different angles of the hospital, showing nothing out of the ordinary, no shadow figures, no impossible shapes, no signs of what had just been here. But something was different. The air felt hollow now, like whatever had pressed against me, whatever had breathed my name, had retreated but not left. It was still here, just out of sight, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. I turned, slowly, carefully, heart pounding against my ribs as my gaze landed on the break room door just a few feet away, the one place I could go to collect myself, to bow and breathe, to try and make sense of what had just happened, because none of it was right, none of it made sense, and yet I had felt it, heard it, seen it. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, and then I stopped. My uniform was soaked in blood. Not fresh, not warm, but dried and dark, stiff against my skin, clinging to my arms, my chest, as if it had been there for hours, as if I had been wearing it all night. I turned to the wall clock. The time was 3:15 a.m., and it wasn't moving. I should have known something was wrong the moment I signed the lease. The price was too low, the paperwork too simple, and the landlord, well, I only ever saw him once. A thin man in an old suit, his smile stretched too wide, his fingers tapping against the table as he slid the contract toward me. He never asked questions, never checked my references. He just said, "Welcome home," and handed me the keys. I should have walked away, but I didn't. The apartment itself was fine. A little old, a little worn, but nothing too bad. The walls were that off-white color that never really looks clean. The floors creaked in places, and the kitchen cabinets stuck when you tried to open them. It smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, like old flowers left to rot. But it was mine, and in the city, finding a place this cheap, it felt like a miracle. I moved in on a Tuesday. The whole process took less than a day, since I didn't have much. Just a mattress, a couch, a small table, and a few boxes of clothes and books. By the evening, I was settled in, sitting on the couch with a takeout container in my lap, watching the light outside fade into the deep blue of night. That's when I heard the first noise. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway outside my door. I put my fork down, listening. They stopped right outside my apartment. I waited. Nothing. After a few seconds, I got up and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The dim overhead light flickered once, buzzing softly. Then I looked down. Wet footprints. Dark, damp smudges on the worn carpet, leading from the far end of the hallway straight to my door. They stopped there, like someone had been standing just outside, watching. A chill crawled up my spine. I backed away slowly, locking the deadbolt even though I knew I had already locked it earlier. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had come in from the rain. Maybe the old pipes made it sound like footsteps. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I turned off the lights and went to bed. But in the silence of my room, I kept thinking about the footprints and how there hadn't been any leading away from my door. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I had work to do, errands to run, normal life things. But as I grabbed my keys to leave, something stopped me cold. The lock. It was different. Yesterday, it had been a simple deadbolt. Today, it was a sliding latch, the kind you'd find on a hotel door. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting itself into knots. I hadn't changed it. No one had. Had they? I ran my fingers over the metal, as if touching it would somehow explain what had happened. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe I hadn't looked at the lock that closely before. Maybe... I stopped myself. No. This was wrong. I reached for my phone to call the landlord, but when I scrolled through my contacts, his number was gone. That was when I started to feel it. The walls pressing in, the ceiling feeling lower than before, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The apartment wasn't just old, it was wrong. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The city outside was alive with noise. Cars honking, people shouting, sirens wailing in the distance. But inside, the apartment was silent. Too silent. Until it wasn't. A soft scraping sound came from the living room. The sound of something being dragged across the floor. I sat up slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Another scrape. Closer this time. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark, my fingers shaking. I turned on the flashlight and crept toward the bedroom door. The air felt colder, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. I stepped into the living room and froze. Everything was wrong. The couch was on the opposite side of the room. The table was pushed against the wall. The boxes I hadn't unpacked yet were stacked neatly in the corner. Someone had moved my things. A sharp, cold terror gripped me. I wanted to believe I had done it myself, maybe in some half-asleep daze, but I knew I hadn't. I would remember. I would. Then I saw the note. A small square piece of paper stuck to the fridge. 3 words. Welcome home. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to. The paper was slightly damp, like someone had held it in their hand for too long before placing it there. The writing was thin, spidery, almost playful. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the apartment. No one there. I checked the front door, still locked, but the lock had changed again. This time, it was a chain. My knees felt weak, my chest was too tight, my breath too shallow. I grabbed my phone and tried the landlord's number again, even though I knew it wasn't there. When that failed, I called the building manager's office. The line rang, and then a voice answered. But it wasn't a person. It wasn't a voice at all. It was laughter. Soft, breathless, right against my ear. I dropped the phone. I had to get out. I had to leave, even if it meant breaking down the door. I grabbed the chain, yanking at it, trying to pull it free. My fingers fumbled with the latch, my breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. And then, just behind me, the whisper. Right against my ear. You'll never leave. I turned so fast I nearly fell. No one was there. The room was empty. But the walls were breathing. The paint pulsed, slow and steady, like something beneath the surface was moving, shifting, waiting. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. Then the lights flickered, and the laughter came again, low, amused, all around me. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking, forcing myself to breathe, to think. When I opened them, the apartment was different. The walls were covered in symbols, deep black markings that twisted and coiled, moving even as I stared at them. The door was gone, and in the mirror across the room, my reflection smiled. Not me. The other me. The one that wasn't supposed to be there. The one that whispered, in my own voice, "You're home." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt like it had turned to stone, rooted to the floor as I stared at the mirror, at the thing inside it, at me, but not me. The reflection was standing there, perfectly still, wearing my clothes, my face, my skin, but its smile was too wide, too knowing, curling up at the edges in a way that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The longer I stared, the more wrong it became. Its eyes weren't mine. They were just slightly too dark, just slightly too deep, like looking into a space that wasn't meant to be seen. It blinked too slowly, tilting its head just enough that I knew, without a doubt, it was looking at me, not at my reflection. At me. My stomach twisted. This isn't real, I told myself. I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming. But the apartment was still there. The floor was still solid beneath my feet, and the symbols on the walls were still moving, shifting, stretching like living ink. My breath was coming too fast, too shallow. My chest felt tight, my hands cold and clammy. And then it spoke. The sound didn't come from the mirror. It came from inside the apartment. "You're home," it said, in my voice. I jerked backward so fast I nearly tripped, slamming against the wall. The reflection hadn't moved. It was still standing there, still smiling, but I heard it. I heard it right next to me. The air felt too thick, pressing against my skin like something unseen was crowding the room. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to do something. But all I could do was watch as my reflection, no, the thing, in the mirror, lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass. A slow, deliberate movement. A gesture. An invitation. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak, my mind screaming at me to move. I turned away, scrambling toward where the door should have been, but the wall was solid, smooth, completely unbroken. There was no door, no way out. I spun in circles, heart pounding, panic clawing up my throat. The apartment wasn't just wrong anymore. It was changing. The furniture was shifting, twisting, stretching taller than it should be. The angles of the walls bending inward, pressing closer. The floor beneath my feet felt softer, like something beneath it was breathing. Then the laughter started again, soft at first, barely a whisper, then louder, closer, surrounding me. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block it out. But it wasn't just sound. It was inside me, curling through my ribs, wrapping around my spine. I gasped, stumbling forward, reaching for anything solid, anything real. But my hands hit smooth glass. The mirror. I had turned back toward it without meaning to. My reflection was still there, still watching. But now, it was moving. Its arms were shifting, stretching, its fingers elongating, its nails curling against the glass with slow, deliberate scratches. It tilted its head again, that same empty smile still carved into its face. Then, without breaking eye contact, it stepped forward, and out of the mirror. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted in the opposite direction, even though I knew there was nowhere to go. The walls weren't walls anymore. They were pulsing, shifting, stretching toward me like living things. I stumbled, crashing into the kitchen counter, knocking over a chair, my vision blues, ring with panic. Behind me, the thing in the mirror laughed. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, my legs weak. my whole body screaming at me to wake up, but this wasn't a dream. Then I felt it. A hand, cold fingers wrapping around my wrist. I screamed, twisting, yanking my arm away. My skin burned where it had touched me, a deep, icy ache sinking into my bones. The thing smiled. "You can't leave," it whispered. I shoved backward, knocking over the table, sending a glass shattering across the floor. My mind was a tangle of terror and disbelief, my chest tight, my limbs shaking. Then I saw it. The journal. It was sitting on the counter, open. The pages covered in the same twisting symbols that covered the walls. The words were blurred, shifting, but I could make out one sentence, written over and over. "Don't let it take your name." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't care what it meant. I grabbed the book, gripping it tight even though my hands were shaking. The thing stepped closer. "You already belong here," it murmured, tilting its head. Its voice was so familiar, exactly like mine. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. The symbols, the words. There had to be something, some way out. The pages flickered, the letters shifting, rearranging. Then, just for a second, they stopped. One sentence stood out. "Say your name. Say it now." I didn't think. I opened my mouth, my voice shaking. "My name is..." But the thing lunged. A hand clamped over my mouth, ice shooting through my veins, my vision going dark at the edges. Its grip was too strong, too solid. My body felt like it was sinking, like the apartment itself was pulling me in. I struggled, kicking, thrashing, trying to break free, but it was holding me too tight. "You don't need that name anymore," it whispered. The walls groaned, the air cracked. The laughter was deafening now, echoing inside my skull. I was losing. Then, with everything I had left, I bit down on its hand, hard. It screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was high-pitched, raw, twisting through the air like something ancient and wrong. The grip on me loosened just enough. I tore myself free, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There wasn't anywhere to go. But I kept moving, pushing through the pulsing, shifting apartment, through the walls that bent and twisted, through the space that wasn't space at all. Then, all at once, I was falling. The world flipped. The ground gave way. My stomach lurched. And then, I was waking up, flat on my back, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet. Still. The walls were normal again. The furniture was in place. The mirror was just a mirror. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then I saw the journal, still sitting on the counter, still open. And the words had changed. "You said your name. You are still you, for now." I stayed on the floor for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. My body felt numb, like I had been dropped from a great height and was only just realizing I had survived the fall. The apartment looked normal again. No shifting walls, no breathing floors, no reflection watching me from the other side of the glass. But normal didn't feel real anymore. Normal felt like a trick. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my arms trembling beneath me. My whole body ached, like I had been running for miles, like I had been fighting something much stronger than me. The memory of its voice still clung to the air, that terrible whisper curling through my thoughts. "You don't need that name anymore." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look around. The furniture was exactly where it should be. The table was upright. The broken glass was gone. The apartment wasn't just normal. It was untouched, as if nothing had ever happened, as if I had dreamed the whole thing. But the journal was still there. It sat on the counter, its pages slightly curled, the ink still fresh. I hadn't imagined that. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady, my pulse still too fast. Every instinct screamed at me not to touch it, but I had to know. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and looked at the open page. The words had changed again. You said your name. You are still you. For now. I felt my stomach twist. My mouth was dry. I flipped through the pages, my fingers shaking. Most of it was unreadable, the words shifting, rearranging themselves the moment I tried to focus on them. But then, near the back, I found something different. A list. Names. Dozens of them, scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. Some were crossed out. Others were written over in different ink, like they had been, and changed or replaced. And at the very bottom, in fresh black ink, was mine. I stumbled back, the journal slipping from my hands and landing on the counter with a soft thud. My name. My actual name. Not a fake one, not a nickname, but the one I had spoken aloud in desperation, the one that had saved me. For now. I didn't want to stay here. Every nerve in my body told me to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But when I turned to the door, my stomach dropped. The lock had changed again. It was different every morning, but this time, it wasn't just a latch or a deadbolt or a chain. This time, there was no lock at all. Just a smooth, solid door with no handle. I reached out, running my fingers over the surface, cold, unmoving. I pushed. Nothing. I slammed my fist against it, my breath coming faster, the first waves of panic curling through my chest. No way out. I turned back to the apartment, my eyes scanning the windows, but I already knew they wouldn't open. They never did. The glass was thick, fogged over, distorting the view of the city beyond. It was like being trapped inside a photograph, the world outside frozen, unreachable. I grabbed my phone, my fingers unsteady as I tried to call the landlord again. The number was still gone. I dialed the building manager's office, but the line just rang and rang until the same sound crackled through the speaker. That laughter. Faint, distant, like someone was sitting just out of sight, waiting for me to realize there was no one to call. I hung up. Think. I had to think. There had to be a way out. If this had happened before, if all those names in the journal were real, if other people had lived here before me, then there had to be something they had learned, something they had left behind. I scanned the apartment, searching for anything out of place. The journal had been in the kitchen, sitting in plain sight, but something told me there was more. Something hidden. The closet. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't looked inside it since moving in. I had shoved a few boxes in there, things I hadn't unpacked yet, and left it alone. But now, standing in the too quiet apartment, I felt it. That heavy, waiting silence. Something was in there. I moved toward it slowly, every step making my skin crawl. The handle felt colder than the rest of the apartment, like the air on the other side was different. I hesitated, then pulled the door open. Darkness. The closet was deeper than I remembered. My boxes were still there, but they looked wrong. Darker, their edges blurred, as if they were sinking into something deeper than shadow. The walls stretched farther back than they should have, the space seeming to grow the longer I looked at it. And then I saw the compartment. It was small, carved into the wooden panel at the back of the closet, barely big enough for a shoebox. The edges were rough, the wood splintered, as if someone had pried it open in a hurry. My hands were ice cold as I reached inside. The first thing I pulled out was a stack of photographs. I turned them over one by one, my breath shallow. Faces. Dozens of them. Some young, some old. Men, women. Every kind of person imaginable. all of them standing in front of this apartment, smiling, holding up their keys, former tenants, and every single one had a red X drawn over their face. My fingers trembled. I flipped through them faster, searching, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then I reached the last photo. It was me. Standing in the doorway, my hand gripping the key, smiling like I had no idea. A red X slashed across my face. The world spun. My stomach lurched. I dropped the photos, stumbling backward, my mind racing. This wasn't just happening to me. It had happened to all of them, and none of them had ever left. I had to get out. I turned back to the closet, yanking at the panel, my breath coming too fast. There had to be something else, some kind of answer, some kind of way out. At the very bottom of the compartment, beneath the photos, was a folded piece of paper. I grabbed it, unfolding it with shaking fingers. 3 words. Burn the name. The apartment groaned. The walls creaked, the air growing heavier, thicker, pressing down on me. The journal was still on the counter, my name fresh in black ink, waiting, claiming me. Burn the name. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if anything would work. But I didn't have any other choice. I grabbed the journal, my heart slamming against my ribs, and I ran for the stove. I nearly tripped over my own feet as I stumbled toward the kitchen, the journal clutched in my shaking hands. My breath was ragged, my mind spinning, the weight of what I had just seen pressing down on my chest like a heavy stone. My picture, the red X, the dozens of other horrors before me. They had all lived here. They had all been trapped. And now it was happening to me. Burn the name. The words on the crumpled paper echoed in my mind, repeating over and over like a pulse. It didn't make sense. How could burning my name change anything? But the apartment wasn't following the rules of logic, of reality, of anything I understood. It was something else. Something shifting and watching. Something that had existed long before I ever stepped through the door. My hands trembled as I turned the stove knob, the old gas burner clicking once, twice, before a weak blue flame flickered to life. The air filled with the sharp scent of gas, and for a moment, the tiny flame was the only thing that felt real. It was warm, solid, something I could control. I hesitated. What if this didn't work? What if I burned the journal and nothing changed? What if I was just destroying my only clue, my only connection to the others who had been here before me? But then I thought of the door with no lock, the windows that wouldn't open, the way the reflection in the mirror had stepped forward, moving like it had always been waiting. I had no choice. I forced myself to move. I tore the page with my name from the journal, my fingers clumsy and stiff. The ink still looked fresh, too fresh, as if it had just been written. I held it over the flame, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The edges curled first, turning black, then orange, then nothing. The ink darkened, the letters twisting and shrinking as the fire ate through the page. I watched as my name warped, distorted, turning to ash between my fingers. Then the apartment screamed. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was inside me, crawling through my skull, rattling my ribs, wrapping around my lungs until I couldn't breathe. The walls groaned, the floor trembled beneath my feet, and the air pulled like something enormous had just woken up. The stove flickered. The flame sputtered, stretching higher for just a moment before vanishing completely. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural. I staggered backward, my breath coming in gasps. The apartment was still. The walls were no longer shifting. The furniture had stopped moving. The mirror in the living room reflected nothing but empty space. Had it worked? My name was gone. I had burned it. The words had turned to ash. But the dread in my stomach hadn't left. It sat there, twisting, curling, whispering that this wasn't over. I turned to look at the door. A lock had returned, but it wasn't the same. The handle was old-fashioned now, round and brass, with a keyhole beneath it. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen it before. It looked like it belonged to a different era, a different time. Slowly, I reached for it, wrapping my fingers around the cool metal. I turned it. The door clicked open. I nearly sobbed in relief, my knees weak. I didn't wait. I yanked it open, expecting to see the hallway of my apartment building, expecting to see the dim, flickering light, the worn carpet, the familiar exit sign at the end of the corridor. But it wasn't there. The hallway was gone. Instead, I was looking into another apartment. Not mine. It was identical in layout, the same shape, the same walls, but it wasn't the same. The colors were wrong, washed out, drained of warmth. The furniture was arranged differently, slightly off, like someone had tried to recreate my space but didn't understand what normal was supposed to look like. The air inside was thick with dust, untouched, forgotten. And then I saw them. The people. At first I thought they were mannequins, standing motionless in the dim light. But then one of them shifted slightly, their head tilting, their body stiff, unnatural. There were at least 6 of them, scattered throughout the room, standing in the corners, by the windows, near the kitchen. Their clothes were outdated, their faces pale, hollow, sunken into themselves. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't mannequins. They were the tenants, the ones from the photos. They had been waiting. One of them moved, their neck cracking as they turned toward me, their expression empty, their mouth slowly pulling into a wide, unnatural smile. Then, all at once, they all turned. My body reacted before my mind could. I slammed the door shut, my pulse roaring in my ears. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting, latching, securing it shut. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wood, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break me apart. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Then the knocking started. Soft at first. A slow, deliberate tap against the wood. Then another. And another. I held my breath, listening. A voice, just on the other side, low, amused. "You burned the name," it whispered. My blood ran cold. The knocking stopped. Silence. I stayed there for what felt like forever, my body frozen, my mind racing. The apartment felt different now, emptier. The walls no longer pulsed, no longer breathed. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust any of it. Slowly, I forced myself to step away from the door, my limbs stiff, my skin crawling with the weight of unseen eyes. I didn't look at the mirror. I didn't look at the closet. I just moved. The apartment was quiet again. But I knew, deep in my bones, that something had changed. I had burned the name. But I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I stayed by the door for a long time, my hand still gripping the handle, even though I knew I wouldn't turn it again. My heart was beating too fast, my skin cold and damp with sweat, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. The hallway was gone. The door had opened into something else. That space, that apartment, that place. It wasn't supposed to be there. The people inside weren't supposed to be there either. They weren't people anymore. The knocking had stopped, but I could still feel them on the other side, waiting, watching, listening. I forced myself to step away, my legs weak, my body heavy with exhaustion. My thoughts were tangled, looping over and over as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had burned my name, just like the note had told me to, and the apartment had changed. The door had opened, but not to the outside, not to safety. I wasn't free. I didn't even know if I was still me. The thought sent a sharp wave of panic through my chest. I turned too fast, nearly stumbling, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I needed to think. I needed to find something, anything, that could tell me what to do next. My gaze landed on the journal. It was still sitting on the counter, its pages slightly curled from the heat of the fire. I moved toward it slowly, every muscle in my body tense, as if the moment I touched it, something would reach out and pull me inside. The writing had changed again. The pages were still filled with shifting, unreadable symbols, but there was something new at the bottom. A short sentence, written in careful, deliberate strokes. "Who are you now?" I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. I tried to answer in my head, to remind myself that I was still the same person, that burning my name hadn't changed anything. But when I opened my mouth, when I tried to say my name, nothing came out. I froze. The air in the apartment seemed to tighten around me, closing in like invisible hands. My throat felt dry, my tongue heavy. I tried again, forcing the sound, but it was like the word had been erased from my mind, like it had never existed in the first place. I couldn't say it. I couldn't even think it. A cold terror spread through my limbs, settling deep in my bones. My name was gone. Not just burned, not just forgotten. Erased. My hands started shaking. I backed away from the journal, from the counter, from everything, until I hit the wall. My breath was uneven, my pulse hammering against my ribs. This couldn't be happening. I had done what the note had said. I had burned the name. I had survived. Hadn't I? I forced myself to move, to do something other than stand there drowning in my own panic. I needed to look at myself, to see if anything else had changed. If my name was gone, what else had been taken? I turned toward the mirror. For a moment, I hesitated. The memory of my reflection stepping forward, the way it had spoken in my voice, the way it had laughed. It was too fresh, too raw. But I had to know. I had to see. I took slow, careful steps toward the glass, my breath shallow, my muscles tense. The apartment was silent, the only sound the soft creaking of the floor beneath my feet. I stopped just in front of the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal. My face stared back at me, my expression pale, my eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. My clothes were wrinkled, my hair messy, my hands still trembling slightly at my sides. But then I noticed it. The reflection wasn't breathing. I was standing there, my chest rising and falling with every shaky breath, but the version of me in the glass was perfectly still. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My reflection stared back, unblinking, unmoving, the same way it had before. Then it tilted its head, just slightly, barely enough to notice. But I hadn't moved. A slow, sick dread curled in my stomach, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. My hands clenched at my sides. The reflection's hands did not. I took a step back. It didn't. I turned away too quickly, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath coming fast and uneven. I felt dizzy, unsteady, the world tilting around me like the floor had shifted under my feet. I didn't look back at the mirror. I couldn't. The journal had asked me a question. Who are you now? I didn't have an answer. The apartment was still wrong. The door had changed, the windows were useless. The space beyond the walls wasn't real. The name I had once owned was nothing but ash now, lost to whatever force controlled this place. I was still here, still moving, still thinking. But was I still me? I didn't know anymore. A sound broke the silence. A soft, slow creak, like weight shifting on the floorboards. From the other side of the room, from behind me, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew what I would see. The reflection, standing outside the mirror, watching, waiting, smiling. I didn't turn around. My body had gone completely still. My breath shallow, my fingers curled so tightly into my palms that I could feel my nails pressing into my skin. The air in the apartment had shifted, thickened, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. Because I knew. I knew the moment I turned around, I would see it standing there. The reflection. It was no longer trapped in the mirror. It was in the room with me now. The floor creaked again, the sound so slow and deliberate that I could almost feel the weight of it, as if something was stepping forward one careful inch at a time. It wasn't rushing. It didn't have to. It knew. I wasn't going anywhere. My breathing was too loud in the silence, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped thing desperate to escape. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would somehow erase what was happening, as if ignoring it would make it go away. But I could feel it standing there, could sense it watching me with that empty, too wide smile. Then it spoke. You took my name. The voice was mine. Not just similar, not just close. It was exactly the way I sounded inside my own head. The same inflections, the same rhythm, the same breath between words. It was like hearing myself recorded, played back in perfect clarity, except I had never spoken those words. My stomach twisted into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. You burned it, it continued, the tone light, almost amused. Now you don't have one either. We match. I felt something move closer, the air shifting just behind me, the presence growing heavier. I wanted to run, to slam my body against the door, to claw at the walls until I found a way out. But I knew that if I moved, if I turned to face it, I would see something I could never unsee. Then it whispered, so close that I swore I felt the words against the back of my neck. Give me yours, I snapped. My body moved before my mind could catch up, my instincts finally overtaking the numb terror that had paralyzed me. I lunged forward, away from the voice, away from the presence, away from it. Running for the kitchen, my hands slamming against the counter as I grabbed the first solid object I could find. The knife. I spun around, the blade clutched in my shaking hands, my breath coming in gasps. But the apartment was empty. There was no one there, except the mirror. And in the mirror, my reflection was still smiling. I stood there, gripping the knife so tightly my fingers ached, my breath uneven, my whole body trembling. The apartment was silent again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was waiting. The air pressed against me, heavy and thick, like something unseen was watching, something just out of reach, just beyond the walls, just beneath the floor. The mirror stood across the room, its surface smooth and still, but my reflection, it, was not frozen like a normal reflection should be. It was watching me, waiting for me to move, its head tilted slightly to the side, its smile just a little too wide. I took a step forward, then another, my pulse pounding in my ears. My reflection didn't mimic the movement. It stayed perfectly still, eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't me anymore. It had never been me. Then, slowly, it lifted its hand and placed it against the glass. A challenge. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to move any closer, but something deep inside me, something instinctual, told me that this was the end, that this was the moment where I had to decide what happened next. My legs felt weak, my chest tight, my skin crawling with something I couldn't name, but I forced myself to keep moving until I was just inches from the mirror. I could see every detail of my reflection, every strand of hair, every shadow beneath my eyes, the rise and fall of my breath, but it wasn't right. It wasn't breathing. It wasn't human. "You don't belong here," I whispered, my voice shaking, but the words felt hollow. My reflection's smile widened just slightly. "Neither do you." I felt my throat tighten. I gripped the knife harder, my knuckles white. Then my reflection moved. Not like before, not a slow tilt of the head, not a shift in its stance. It stepped forward. But the mirror didn't shatter. The glass didn't even ripple. It moved through the surface as if it had never been solid in the first place. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nowhere to run. The last thing I saw before it lunged was its mouth opening, far too wide, a dark, yawning void that swallowed its face. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was standing in front of the mirror again, but this time, I was inside it. I reached out, pressing my hands against the glass, but the surface was solid now. The apartment beyond the mirror was still, untouched, unfamiliar. My own body stood in my place, gripping the knife, smiling at the reflection, at me. It turned away, stepping into the apartment, rolling its shoulders like it was getting used to the weight of being real. Then, without looking back, it walked toward the door. And this time, it opened. My brother drowned in this lake. It happened 2 years ago. We were just kids then, messing around on the shore, skipping rocks and laughing like nothing in the world could touch us. But the lake, it touched him. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. They found his body 3 days later, floating face down near the reeds. His skin was pale, his lips blue, and his eyes were wide open, like he'd seen something in the water, something that scared him. I haven't been back to the lake since, not until last night. I don't know why I went. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the nightmares that keep pulling me back to that day. Whatever it was, I found myself standing on the shore, staring at the water as it rippled under the moonlight. It was calm, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching me. And then I heard it. Emily. My name. Whispered so softly, I almost thought I imagined it. But I didn't. It was real. And it came from the lake. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, but I knew it. I'd know it anywhere. It was my brother's voice. "Emily?" It called again, louder this time. "I'm here." I took a step back, my legs trembling. This wasn't possible. My brother was dead. I'd seen his body. I'd been to his funeral. But the voice, it sounded so real, so alive. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't happening." But it was. And the worst part? Part of me wanted to answer. Part of me wanted to step into the water and find him. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and ran, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears long after I'd left the lake behind. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice. "Emily, I'm here." Over and over, like a broken record. By morning I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop thinking about the lake. About him. I had to go back. I told myself it was just to prove it wasn't real. that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening at the lake. Something I couldn't explain. When I got there, the sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. It looked so normal, so harmless. But I knew better. I walked along the shore, my eyes scanning the ground for, I don't know what. Proof, maybe. Something to show I wasn't crazy. And then I saw them. Footprints. They started at the water's edge and led up onto the shore, wet and fresh, like someone had just walked out of the lake. My stomach twisted into knots as I followed them with my eyes. They were small, about the size of my brother's feet. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The footprints were real, and they were heading toward the woods. I should have turned around. I should have run and never looked back. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to know. So I followed them. The footprints led me deep into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air was damp and cold, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my feet. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Finally, the footprints stopped. They just ended, like whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the ground, my heart racing. What the hell was going on? And then I heard it. "Emily." His voice, coming from behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, just trees and shadows. But I knew what I'd heard. "Emily," the voice said again, closer this time. "Come outside." I found a way back. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran, my feet slipping on the wet leaves as I bolted back toward the lake. I didn't stop until I was back on the shore, gasping for air. The lake was still and quiet, just like before. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was happening, it was just beginning. I didn't go back to the lake that night. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. But the lake, it didn't let me go that easily. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. "Emily." His voice, coming from outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding. "No," I whispered, pulling the blankets tighter around me. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. And it wasn't just his voice this time. There was something else, a sound I couldn't quite place. A soft, wet sloshing, like someone walking through water. I got up and crept to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the yard. At first, I didn't see anything, just grass and shadows. But then I noticed something moving near the edge of the trees. It was a figure, small and hunched over, its skin pale and glistening in the moonlight. It was too far away to see clearly, but I knew who it was. I knew. "Emily," the figure whispered, its voice carrying on the wind. "Come outside. I'm here." I slammed the curtain shut and backed away from the window, my heart racing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be, but it was, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I went to the cemetery. My brother's grave was at the far end, under a big oak tree. I hadn't been there since the funeral. I couldn't bring myself to. But now, I had to see it. I had to know. When I got there, I froze. The ground in front of the headstone was disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. And the coffin, it was empty. I fell to my knees, my hands shaking as I stared at the hole in the ground. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But it was. My brother's body was gone, and I knew where it was. I went back to the lake that night. I didn't want to, but I had to. I had to see him. I had to know the truth. The moon was high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the water. The lake was still, the surface like glass, but I knew better. I knew what was beneath it. I stood on the shore, my feet sinking into the wet sand. The air was cold, and I could see my breath in the moonlight. I felt like I was being watched, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was too scared of what I might see. And then I heard it. Emily. His voice, coming from the water. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the middle of the lake, the water lapping at his waist. His skin was pale, his hair wet and clinging to his face, and his eyes, they were black, like the water itself. "The water is warm," he said, his voice soft and inviting. "Come see." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I whispered. "You're not real. You're not him." But he was, and he was smiling, a smile too wide, too wrong. "Come on, Emily," he said, taking a step closer. "Don't you miss me?" I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Stay away from me." But he didn't. He kept coming, the water rippling around him as he moved closer to the shore. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and wet, wrapping around my ankle. I screamed, looking down to see a pale, bloated hand sticking out of the water, its fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong. It was pulling me in. "No!" I shouted, kicking at the hand with my free foot. "Let me go!" But it didn't. It just pulled harder, dragging me closer to the water. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, the water rising around my legs. I was going to drown, just like him. And then, suddenly, the hand let go. I stumbled back, falling onto the shore as the figure in the water disappeared beneath the surface. I sat there gasping for air, my whole body trembling. What the hell had just happened? I didn't wait to find out. I got up and ran, not stopping until I was back in my house, the door locked behind me. But I knew it wasn't over. The lake, it wasn't done with me. The next morning I went back to the lake. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it in the daylight. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it was real. When I got there, the shore was empty. The water was calm, the sun reflecting off its surface like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what was beneath it. And then I saw them. Footprints. My footprints. Leading from the shore into the water. My heart stopped. I hadn't gone into the water. I hadn't. But the footprints, they were mine. I could see the pattern of my sneakers in the wet sand. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was, and I knew what it meant. The lake had taken my brother, and now it wanted me. That night I heard it again, his voice, calling my name. "Emily." I didn't answer. I couldn't, but I knew it wasn't for me anymore. It was for someone else. And now, at night, I call their names, and I see them coming. Have you ever had that feeling like someone's watching you? Even when you're alone, even when there's no reason for it, you just know? I've had it since the moment we got here. We picked Black Hollow Lake for our camping trip because it was supposed to be quiet, secluded. Untouched wilderness, the website had said. Just us, the trees, and the water. Sounded perfect. But now, standing at the edge of the forest, staring out at the still, black lake, I wonder if we made a mistake. "Come on, man, help set up the tent," James calls out, snapping me from my thoughts. He's already half done, wrestling with the stubborn fabric. Rachel and Olivia are by the fire pit, arguing over the best way to start a fire. I force myself to look away from the lake and grab the last pole for the tent. Yeah, I got it. The sun is dipping below the tree line, shadows stretching long across the ground. The trees here grow too close together, thick and knotted, their branches curling toward each other like grasping fingers. The deeper into the woods you look, the darker it seems. Even now, with the last light of day, the spaces between the trees look like open mouths. James elbows me. Dude, you good? You're zoning out. I shake it off. Yeah, just tired from the drive. Rachel finally gets the fire going, and we settle in for the night. The flames flicker, casting shifting shapes onto the trees. Olivia passes around the marshmallows. We tell stupid stories, laugh too loudly, pretend we don't hear the occasional rustling from the woods. It's just the wind, just some animal. Then later, when we're in the tent, it happens. Scourge. A slow, deliberate scrape against the fabric of the tent. James shifts beside me. What the hell was that? I hold my breath. It happens again. Scourge. Long and slow, like nails dragging against the nylon. Rachel lets out a nervous laugh. It's probably a raccoon or something. Then comes a sound that makes my skin crawl. A tap, tap, tap. Right against the thin layer of fabric between us and the night. I whisper, "Animals don't tap." Silence. I reach for the flashlight, flick it on, and aim it toward the sound. Nothing. Just the tent wall. I take a deep breath. I'm gonna check outside. James grabs my arm. Dude. No. I shake him off and unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The fire has burned low, casting everything in a dim, pulsing glow. The woods are still. I don't see anything. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. See? I whisper. Nothing. Then just as I'm about to zip the tent back up, I hear it. A voice. Faint. Just at the edge of the trees. Hello? It's barely more than a whisper, but it freezes me in place. The voice is wrong. Not quite human, like someone trying to mimic speech, but missing something essential. James must hear it too because he mutters, "Nope, absolutely not." I zip the tent shut, heart pounding. None of us sleep. We didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could still hear that whisper, just barely audible over the crackling embers of the fire. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the long drive and the eerie atmosphere of the woods were messing with my head. But I knew the others had heard it too. No one wanted to admit it, though. By the time dawn started bleeding through the trees, we were exhausted, but none of us wanted to talk about what had happened. Instead, we went through the motions. Rachel started the fire back up. Olivia dug through the supplies for something to eat. James busied himself with his pocket knife, carving useless little marks into a piece of wood. I just sat there, staring at the edge of the forest, wondering if I had imagined the voice, or if something had actually been out there, watching us. Rachel forced a smile as she passed around protein bars. "All right, so who's up for a hike today?" James snorted. "Right, because wandering deeper into the woods after last night sounds like a solid plan." "Come on, it was probably just an animal," Rachel said, though her voice wavered slightly. "We're just psyching ourselves out. If we sit around camp all day thinking about it, we're gonna freak ourselves out even more." Olivia nodded, but her hands were shaking as she unwrapped her granola bar. "Yeah, I mean, we didn't see anything, right? And if something was actually out there, it would have, I don't know, I did something worse than just tapping on the tent." I didn't answer. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the trees. The spaces between them were impossibly dark. Even now, with the sunlight filtering through the leaves, Something about them felt off, like they weren't just trees, but something watching, waiting, holding their breath. Rachel sighed. Okay, look, if we keep acting scared, it's just gonna get worse. Let's go on the hike, take some pictures, and remind ourselves there's nothing out here except nature. Agreed? James groaned. Fine, but if we see anything weird, I'm turning back. So we packed our bags, made sure the fire was fully out, and headed toward the hiking trail that wound around Black Hollow Lake. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a normal morning. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, birds were chirping in the distance. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. The deeper we walked into the forest, the quieter it became. The birdsong faded, the breeze disappeared. Even the sound of our own footsteps felt muffled, like the trees were swallowing every noise we made. The path narrowed, the trees pressing in closer on either side, their gnarled roots reaching up through the dirt like fingers. James was the first to notice it. What the hell is that? We stopped walking. Just ahead, in a small clearing off the trail, there was a circle of stones. At first, I thought it was just an old fire pit, maybe left behind by another group of campers. But as we stepped closer, I realized there was something wrong about it. The stones were arranged in a perfect ring, each one smooth and uniform, almost too precise to be natural. And in the very center of the circle, the dirt was dark and wet. Fresh blood. Rachel made a choking sound. Okay. Nope. Absolutely not. Olivia took a step back, shaking her head. This isn't normal. Who would do this? James knelt down beside the stones, squinting at the blood. It's fresh, like really fresh. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. We should go back to camp. Rachel nodded quickly. Yeah, we should definitely go back. But just as we turned to leave, Olivia made a strangled noise in the back of her throat. She was staring at the trees. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide, lips slightly parted like she wanted to scream but couldn't force the sound out. I followed her gaze, my stomach twisting. There, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making a sound. It was just standing there. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of it. A tall, thin figure, its body blending with the shadows of the trees. But its eyes were too bright, too white, like twin pinpricks of light staring straight at us. A cold, creeping terror crawled up my spine. We need to go. Now. No one argued. We turned and practically ran back toward camp, our footsteps pounding against the dirt path. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see if it was following us. When we finally reached our campsite, we didn't stop. James rushed straight for the car, fumbling with the keys. But as soon as he turned the ignition, all we heard was a sick, empty clicking sound. Are you kidding me? James slammed his hands against the steering wheel. No, not now. Rachel was breathing hard, gripping Olivia's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Try it again. James turned the key again. Click, click. Nothing. Battery's dead, he muttered. Or something is wrong with the engine. I don't know. I turned, staring back at the trail we had just come from. The trees loomed, their branches swaying slightly even though there was no wind. My pulse thundered in my ears. We were 20 miles from the nearest town. No cell service. And someone, had been watching us. Rachel took a shaky breath. Okay, we'll figure this out. We just need to stay calm. James ran a hand through his hair. Stay calm. Did you see that thing? I glanced at Olivia, who hadn't said a word since we'd gotten back. She was staring at the ground, her hands clenched at her sides. Her lips were moving, but too softly for me to hear. I took a step closer. Olivia? She didn't look up. I leaned in, straining to hear what she was whispering under her breath. It's waiting. A shiver raced down my spine. What? I whispered. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, like she wasn't fully there. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like her own, she whispered again. It's waiting. I didn't know what to say. Olivia was just standing there, her lips barely moving, repeating those same two words over and over again. It's waiting. The way she said it sent a deep, twisting feeling into my gut, like I had already heard those words before, but couldn't remember when or where. James and Rachel must have heard it too, because they both went quiet, the air between us thick with something unspoken, something none of us wanted to acknowledge. Then suddenly, Olivia stopped. She blinked, as if just realizing where she was, and looked around at the rest of us with confusion clouding her face. What? She asked, her voice small. Ree? Rachel took a step toward her, hesitated, then asked, Olivia, what were you just saying? She frowned. Saying? I wasn't saying anything. James let out a short, nervous laugh. Oh, this is so messed up. I forced a swallow past the tightness in my throat. Maybe she really didn't remember. Maybe it was just stress, exhaustion, the fear messing with her head. Maybe it was messing with all of us. We should stay together tonight, I finally said. No one sleeps alone. Rachel nodded quickly. Yes. Agreed. James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah. Fine. But first thing in the morning, we try the car again. If it still won't start, we hike out. I'm not staying here another night. None of us argued. We spent the rest of the day pretending to be normal. We cooked a sad, rushed dinner over the fire, trying to fill the silence with small talk. But every time the conversation died, all we could hear was the eerie quiet of the forest pressing in around us. No birds, no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves that always seemed too close, even when there was nothing there. The sun sank behind the trees too quickly, and the moment darkness settled over the campsite, the fire became our only source of comfort. The flames flickered in the pit, casting shifting shadows along the tent walls, distorting them into strange, unfamiliar shapes. We sat in a tight circle around it, not really talking anymore, just listening, waiting for something none of us wanted to name. Rachel checked her watch. Midnight. She gave a weak laugh. Happy witching hour. James tossed another log into the fire, sending a shower of embers into the air. No one's sleeping, are they? No one answered. Then came the first sound. A rustling, just beyond the tree line. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy to be the wind, too steady to be an animal. I felt every muscle in my body go rigid, my fingers digging into the fabric of my jeans. Rachel whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," James breathed. The rustling stopped. Silence settled over us again, thick and suffocating. We were frozen, too scared to move, barely daring to breathe. I strained my ears, listening, waiting for it to start again. And then, from the darkness beyond the trees, we heard the whisper, "Hello?" My heart nearly stopped. It was the same voice from last night, the same unnatural, almost human sound. But this time it was closer. James grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping between the trunks. Nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes staring back at us. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. Then Olivia gasped. We turned to look at her. She was staring at the tent, her mouth slightly open, her breath coming fast and shallow. "What?" Rachel whispered. "What is it?" Slowly, Olivia raised a shaking hand and pointed at the fabric. We followed her gaze. And then we saw it. A shadow. It was pressed up against the side of the tent, unmoving, its shape distorted by the flickering firelight. It wasn't one of ours. It was on the outside. James swore under his breath, his grip tightening around the flashlight. He turned it toward the tent, but the moment the light touched the fabric, the shadow moved. It stretched, elongated, then melted away as if it had never been there at all. Rachel let out a small, terrified sound, her hand covering her mouth. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. "We should go inside the tent. All of us. Just until morning." James nodded quickly. Yeah, okay." We scrambled inside, zipping the entrance tight behind us, sealing ourselves in like that thin layer of fabric was actually going to keep us safe. The fire outside was still burning, its dim light casting a faint glow through the material, but the rest of the world beyond it was lost to the darkness. We sat in silence, huddled together in the center of the tent, listening, waiting. Then came the scratching, slow, careful, like something was testing the material. Scratch. Rachel clutched my arm, her fingers digging in so hard it hurt. Scratch. The sound circled the tent. Whatever it was moving, dragging its nails, or claws or whatever it had, along the fabric as it went. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a few heart-pounding moments, there was only silence. And then Olivia screamed. I turned just in time to see something, a hand, an arm, shoot through the tent's entrance and grab her by the ankle. She was dragged backward so fast I barely had time to react. She clawed at the floor, kicking, gasping, her fingers scraping against the material. James lunged forward, grabbing onto her wrist. "Hold on!" he shouted, yanking with everything he had. Rachel screamed, scrambling to help, grabbing Olivia's other arm. But whatever had her was strong, too strong. And then, as quickly as it had started, it let go. Olivia collapsed onto the floor of the tent, panting, shaking, her eyes wide and wild. We rushed to her side, Rachel gripping her shoulders, James swearing under his breath. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. She was staring past me, past all of us, through the open tent flap and out toward the lake. Rachel reached out, gently shaking her. "Olivia, say something." Then Olivia spoke, but the voice that came out of her mouth wasn't her own. "It's waiting." The words were flat, empty, spoken in a way that made my stomach turn. James cursed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." Olivia blinked, her eyes focusing again, and when she finally looked at us, she frowned. "What's wrong?" Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. You just said..." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my hands were trembling. "You don't remember?" Olivia shook her head slowly. "Remember what?" James stood up abruptly. "That's it. First light, we're out of here. I don't care if we have to walk 20 miles. I'm not staying here another night." None of us argued. The fire outside was nearly out, its last embers glowing weakly in the dark. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. At some point, just before dawn, I thought I heard it again. A whisper. So close, it could have been inside the tent with us. "It's waiting." None of us really slept. The night stretched on forever, an endless loop of silence and waiting, our ears straining for every tiny noise outside the tent. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew the sky was a dull gray, the first signs of dawn creeping through the trees. My body ached from lying stiff on the ground all night, my muscles tense from the fear that had coiled inside me. James was the first to move. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Without saying a word, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I followed, my breath catching as I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting for us. But the woods were empty. Rachel and Olivia emerged a few moments later, Olivia moving slower than the rest of us, her face pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't said much after last night, and none of us knew what to say to her. She didn't remember being dragged, didn't remember speaking in that strange, hollow voice. She just kept asking why we were all looking at her like that. James walked straight to the car, yanked open the driver's side door, and shoved the key into the ignition. We all held our breath as he turned it. The engine gave a pathetic, stuttering click, then silence. James cursed under his breath, trying again. Click, click. Nothing. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. Rachel's voice was tight with panic. "It has to start. Try it again." "I don't think it's going to," James muttered, but he turned the key again anyway. The result was the same. The car was dead. "Then we walk," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "It's 20 miles, but if we leave now, we can make it before dark." James exhaled slowly, nodding. Yeah, okay." We packed as quickly as we could, stuffing only the essentials into our backpacks. Water, food, flashlights, anything we thought we might need. The whole time Olivia was quiet, her movements slow, almost mechanical, like she wasn't entirely here, with us. I kept watching her out of the corner of my eye, waiting for her to snap out of it, but she never did. Just as we were about to leave, Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the small, rotting cabin near the edge of the lake. "Should we check that place first? Maybe there's a radio or something inside." James looked at her like she was insane. "You want to go inside that creepy shack right now? If it helps us get out of here faster." "Yeah," she shot back. James sighed, but didn't argue. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was warped and blackened with age, the windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. The door hung slightly open, the hinges rusted. As we stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned beneath our weight, threatening to collapse under us. Rachel pushed the door open all the way, and the smell hit us immediately. A thick, musty scent of rot and dampness, mixed with something else. Something metallic. It took me a second to recognize it. Blood. Inside, the cabin was small and empty, the furniture reduced to broken, decaying remains. A table sat against the far wall, one of its legs missing, a layer of dust thick enough to write in covering its surface. A single chair lay on its side near the fireplace, its wooden frame splintered. The only thing that looked untouched was a Esmant Al, leather-bound book sitting in the center of the table. Rachel stepped forward cautiously, reaching for it. When she picked it up, dust billowed into the air, catching the weak beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. She flipped it open, her fingers trembling slightly as she read. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel swallowed. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places, but she read aloud. "It comes at night. It watches from the trees. It chooses one of us, and we never see them again." My stomach tightened. "Keep reading." Rachel's eyes flicked across the page. "There is no escape. It won't let us leave. The trees shift when we try to run, leading us back to the lake. I don't know how much longer we can last." James let out a sharp breath. "Okay, screw this. We're leaving now." Rachel turned the page, her fingers shaking. The last entry was scrawled in jagged, desperate letters. "It takes one of us every night. Don't let it see you." Silence filled the cabin, heavy and suffocating. The words sank into me like cold metal, lodging deep inside my ribs. "We need to go," I said. Rachel nodded quickly. shutting the journal and tucking it under her arm. She didn't want to leave it behind. Neither did I. As we stepped back outside, the air felt different. Heavier. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the trees, making the branches creak and sway. The lake was still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the dull gray sky above. We started walking. Fast. The trail leading away from the campsite was narrow, winding through the dense trees, but we kept our pace steady, pushing forward, determined to put as much distance between us and Black Hollow as possible. But after an hour of walking, something was wrong. James stopped suddenly, his breath coming fast. "Wait." We all stopped. Rachel frowned. "What?" James turned in a slow circle, his face pale. "We've been here before." "That's not possible," I said, but as I looked around, my stomach dropped. The trees, the curve of the trail, the fallen log to our left. I had seen this exact spot before. Rachel shook her head. "No, we've been walking in a straight line. We haven't turned around." "Then explain that," James snapped, pointing at the ground. We followed his gaze. My breath caught. Our footprints. Dozens of them. Circling. Overlapping. Leading right back to where we started. A cold, sick feeling spread through me. The words from the journal echoed in my mind. The trees shift when we try to run. Rachel took a step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't happening." Olivia made a small noise in the back of her throat. When I turned to look at her, I felt something tighten around my ribs. She was staring up at the trees, her head tilted slightly, her eyes glazed over. Rachel reached for her. "Olivia?" She didn't respond. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was empty, cold. And then, in that same hollow, unnatural voice, she whispered, "It's waiting." James grabbed my arm. "We have to keep moving." But Olivia didn't move. She was still staring at the trees, her expression vacant, like something had hollowed her out and left only an empty shell behind. Rachel touched her arm. "Olivia, come on, we have to go." But Olivia didn't look at her. She didn't look at any of us. She just kept smiling. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, she said, "You can't leave." The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, whipping through our clothes, stinging our skin. The branches above swayed violently, the whole forest groaning as if it were alive. Then the whisper came again. Not from Olivia this time, from the woods. "Hello?" It was close, too close. And then, just beyond the trees, the figure stepped into view. Tall, thin, eyes like burning white stars. Watching, waiting, smiling. I couldn't breathe. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, motionless, its shape too thin, its proportions wrong, its limbs stretching too long in the shadows. Its eyes weren't eyes at all, but two white voids, empty and endless, like staring into the reflection of something that didn't belong in this world. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen one before. The whisper came again, curling through the trees like a living thing, wrapping itself around my ribs, tightening, pressing against my skull. "Hello?" It didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a command. A summons. James grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to bruise. "We have to go. Right now." But Olivia didn't move. She was still staring, her face blank, her lips parted slightly in that eerie, empty smile. She wasn't afraid. That was the worst part. She wasn't afraid. Rachel reached for her, shaking her by the shoulders, her voice high and thin with panic. "Olivia, snap out of it! We have to go!" Olivia blinked once, slow and deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost amused. You can't leave." Then she turned and started walking toward the figure. "No." My own voice barely made a sound, my throat tight, my pulse hammering. "No, Olivia, stop." She didn't. James lunged forward, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her back, but the moment his hand closed around her wrist, she screamed. The sound tore through the air, splitting open the silence of the forest, too loud, too raw, like something inside her was breaking. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, her body convulsing, the scream turning into a choked, gurgling sob. Rachel was crying now, her hands over her mouth, backing away, her whole body trembling. What do we do? Oh God, what do we do? I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. My mind felt stretched too thin, unraveling at the edges, fraying under the weight of something I couldn't understand. The rules of the world we knew didn't work here. The figure hadn't moved. It was still standing there, still watching, waiting. And then it smiled. Not with its mouth. It didn't have a mouth. But I felt it made me smile. A deep, curling amusement, a hunger pressing against the inside of my skull. James was still holding Olivia's arm, shaking her, calling her name, trying to get her to come back, but she was still whispering, her voice barely audible. "It's waiting. It's waiting. It's waiting." Then she stopped. And slowly, stiffly, like a puppet on broken strings, she lifted her head. Her eyes were black. I stumbled backward, my breath catching, a sound like a strangled sob escaping my throat. Rachel was frozen, her whole body rigid, her eyes wide and unblinking. James let go of Olivia so fast he nearly fell over. She stood up slowly, her movements jerky, unnatural. When she spoke, her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was layered, hollow, like something else was speaking through her. "You were never going to leave." Then she lunged. James barely had time to react before she was on him, knocking him to the ground, her fingers clawing at his throat, her strength impossible, unnatural. He gasped, choking, struggling beneath her. Rachel screamed. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy branch from the ground, and swung it as hard as I could. It cracked against the side of Olivia's head, sending her sprawling onto the dirt. She twitched once, then went still. James scrambled away, coughing, clutching his throat. Rachel was sobbing, her hands shaking, her whole body curled in on itself. I turned back toward the trees. The figure was gone. The whisper had stopped. The air was too still, too silent, the forest holding its breath. I swallowed, my hands shaking, my pulse slamming against my ribs. We have to go. Right now. James pulled himself to his feet, his face pale, his hands still shaking. Rachel nodded, wiping her face, her breaths coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Then Olivia laughed. We froze. Slowly, impossibly, she sat up. Her head lolled to one side, her eyes still pitch black, her face twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. You can't run, she whispered. Then the forest moved. The trees twisted, shifting, their trunks bending impossibly, their roots pushing through the dirt like grasping fingers. The path we had taken was gone. The trail had disappeared, swallowed by the shifting landscape, leading us right back to the lake. Rachel made a choking sound. No, 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 no. James grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. What do we do? I didn't know. My brain was screaming, my instincts shrieking at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest wasn't just a forest anymore. It was alive. It was part of it. And then Olivia stood up, tilting her head, her black eyes gleaming in the pale light. You're already home, she whispered. I don't remember what happened after that. I remember running. I remember Rachel screaming. I remember James grabbing me, pulling me toward the water. The last thing I remember was the feeling of something cold wrapping around my ankles, pulling me under. Then I woke up. I was in the tent, alone. The fire had gone out. The campsite was silent. I sat up too fast, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. James? Rachel? Olivia? My voice was hoarse, raw, but there was no answer. I scrambled out of the tent, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The forest was empty. The car was gone. The footprints, the scattered supplies, the broken tree branches from our struggle. Gone. It was like they had never been here at all. Then I saw it. The cabin. The door was open, swaying slightly in the breeze. And inside, sitting on the table, was the journal. I stepped closer, my legs weak, my stomach twisting into knots. The book was open. The pages were blank, all except for one, a fresh entry, written in my own handwriting. It's my turn now. I don't remember writing it. I don't remember anything. But as I stand here, staring at the lake, I feel it calling me. The water is warm, and something is waiting. You ever have a job you hate but can't quit? That's where I was when I started working the night shift at Milton's 24-hour grocery. It wasn't a bad place, just a regular store with 2 bright fluorescent lights, faded linoleum floors, and that weird grocery store smell that's part stale bread, part cleaning chemicals. I took the job to pay off my student loans, but really, I should have just let the debt collectors take me. The pay was awful, the customers were worse, and the worst part? I was the only one working after midnight. The manager, Mr. Langley, was a short, round man with a permanent sweat stain on his collar. He handed me my uniform, a stiff red polo with a name tag that already had my name on it. "Your shift's easy," he said, chewing on a toothpick. "Stock shelves, clean up, check out customers, and one rule." He leaned in close. His breath smelled like coffee and something sour. "Don't go into the freezer. Not for anything." That should have been my first warning, but I needed the job, so I just nodded. At exactly 11:59 p.m., Mr. Langley walked out. The glass door slid open, and the second he stepped outside, they slammed shut behind him. I heard the lock click. That's when I realized I was alone, or at least I thought I was. For the first hour, everything was normal. A couple of late-night shoppers wandered the aisles, their faces tired and blank. A man in a hoodie bought a 6-pack of beer. A woman with red eyes asked if we carried any fresh bread, but I told her the bakery closed at 10. Then, around 1 a.m., things got weird. I was stocking shelves when I heard it. A slow, rhythmic squeak. The sound of a shopping cart rolling across the floor. I turned my head. Aisle 7 was empty. I walked over, expecting to find some kid messing around, but the aisle was still and silent, just rows of cereal boxes and cans of soup. Then I saw them, wet footprints, a trail of them, leading down the aisle. The prints were too big to be barefoot, but they weren't quite shoe prints either, more like something melted, like the water had burned into the tile instead of drying. I felt a shiver run up my spine. This is fine, I told myself. It's just someone tracked in water. No big deal. I grabbed my mop and cleaned the prints. When I looked up, a woman was standing at the end of the aisle. I hadn't heard her walk up. She was tall and thin, dressed in a long, old-fashioned coat that nearly touched the floor. Her hands were hidden in the sleeves, and when I looked at her face, I had to swallow a scream. She had no eyes, no nose, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Her mouth opened. "Excuse me." Her voice was too normal, like a teacher asking a question. "Can you help me?" My brain screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen in place. I forced myself to speak. Sure. I need the special meat." The way she said it sent something cold crawling down my neck. We have a butcher section. No. Her voice sharpened. The special meat. I shook my head. I don't know what that is. She raised her hand and grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were long, too long, cold and slimy, like they'd been soaking in something rotten. Her grip tightened. Find it for me. I yanked my arm back. She let go too easily, like she'd only wanted to scare me. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Not toward the exit, not toward another aisle. She walked straight toward the freezer section and vanished. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. I rubbed my wrist, expecting it to be red or bruised, but my skin was normal. No marks, no sign she'd ever touched me. I glanced at the security cameras. They were off. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to bang on the doors and scream for someone to let me out. But I knew, deep down, that the doors wouldn't open. Not after midnight. Not until dawn. So, I did the only thing I could do. I finished mopping, grabbed a can of soda from the fridge and sat behind the checkout counter. I told myself I was fine. But when I raised the soda to my lips, I froze. My hands smelled like something metallic, like blood. And when I glanced down the aisle, the wet footprints were back. Only this time, they were leading toward me. The smell of blood clung to my hands. No matter how much I wiped them on my pants, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was there. Sharp. Metallic. The footprints hadn't been there a second ago, but now they stretched across the linoleum, inching toward me like something unseen had just walked right up to the register. I gripped the edge of the counter, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was not alone. I tried to focus, to listen for anything. Breathing, footsteps, the hum of the freezers at the back of the same. But the only sound was the buzzing fluorescent lights above me. They flickered slightly, casting faint shadows that moved when nothing else did. I needed to get out of here. I pushed myself up and rushed to the front doors, slamming my hands against the glass. The automatic sensors didn't react. They didn't even try to slide open. I pressed my face against the cool surface, peering out into the parking lot. It was empty. No cars, no streetlights, just an ocean of darkness beyond the reach of the store's flickering sign. I fumbled for my phone, pulling it from my pocket with trembling hands. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just a blank screen, like I'd been cut off from the rest of the world. A scraping noise echoed from behind me. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. A shopping cart sat in the middle of aisle 3, tilted slightly to one side. It wasn't there before. I knew it wasn't. I took a step back. The cart wobbled, its wheels letting out a soft squeak as if someone had just let go of it. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. Hello? No answer. I didn't expect one. I turned back toward the doors, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Maybe there was a way to override the lock. Maybe I could. Something cold brushed against the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart slamming into my ribs. Nothing. Just the empty store. But the shopping cart? It was closer. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen it roll forward. But there it was, just a few feet away from me now, its front wheels pointed right at me. My stomach twisted. This isn't happening. This is just exhaustion. A prank. Something I can explain. The store was silent again. Too silent. Even at night there were always sounds. Refrigerators humming, the soft rustle of air conditioning. But now, nothing. It was like the whole store had been swallowed up by something vast and empty. And then I heard it. A whisper. Right behind me. It was soft, almost gentle. A breath against my ear. Help me. I ran. I didn't think so. Didn't look back. I just bolted toward the back of the store, weaving between aisles, my sneakers squeaking against the tile. My lungs burned, my heart hammering so fast it felt like it might give out. The stockroom. I could hide there. I threw myself at the door, shoving it open and slamming it shut behind me. I twisted the lock, backing away until my shoulders hit a stack of boxes. Silence. The whisper was gone. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. The stockroom was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs buzzing faintly. Rows of shelves stretched toward the ceiling, filled with cardboard boxes and shrink-wrapped pallets. The air smelled like dust and something else. Something damp. I stayed there for a long time. Minutes. Maybe an hour. Then, just as I was starting to believe it was over, I noticed something. A book. It was sitting on a metal shelf near the back, thick and covered in dust. It didn't belong there. The stockroom only had inventory lists and schedules, not old, leather-bound books. I hesitated, but something in my gut told me I needed to see it. I stepped forward, my hands still shaking, and brushed the dust from the cover. No title, just deep scratches along the spine, as if someone had tried to carve words into the leather but never finished. I opened it. The pages were yellowed, filled with tight, cramped handwriting. Names, dozens of names, all written in ink, each one followed by a date. I flipped to the most recent page. My blood ran cold. The last entry was from 2 weeks ago. Isaac Green, midnight shift, disappeared. I knew that name. I remembered hearing Mr. Langley mention him. He was the guy who worked before me. He quit suddenly, they said. Just stopped showing up. I turned the page. There was one more entry. A name written in shaking, uneven letters. My name. And below it, scrawled in red ink, "They're in the freezer." I slammed the book shut. A slow, rhythmic creak echoed through the stockroom. The door. Someone was opening the door. I backed up, my breath caught in my throat. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and thin. I wasn't alone. And the store wasn't done with me yet. The door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but the dim glow of the store beyond. My body screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there, frozen. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow on the floor stretched further, twisting unnaturally as if something was slithering forward instead of stepping. I gripped the ledger in my shaking hands, as if it could somehow protect me. My name was in it. That meant I was next. A whisper curled through the air. "They're in the freezer." I didn't move and to look. I didn't want to see who, what, was standing at the door. But my body betrayed me. My eyes lifted. The woman from before. The one with no eyes. She stood in the doorway, her head tilted, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Her skin was too pale, too stretched, like a mask barely clinging to a skull. Her mouth was the only feature on her face, wide and thin, as if it had been cut into her skin instead of being something she was born with. She didn't move. Neither did I. Then she whispered again. "You need to see." Her hand lifted, one long, bony finger pointing toward the back of the stockroom. To the freezer. No, I wasn't going in there. I shook my head. I can't. My voice barely worked. I don't want to. The woman tilted her head further, almost unnaturally far, like her neck was made of rubber. "You need to." The lights flickered. A gust of freezing air rushed through the room, curling around me like icy fingers dragging me forward. The freezer door groaned open on its own. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs moved on their own. One step, then another. The woman didn't follow. She only stood there smiling. The cold thickened as I reached the doorway. My breath came out in pale, shuddering clouds. The inside of the freezer stretched further than it should have. Rows of hanging slabs of meat, glistening under the flickering bulbs. But something was wrong. The smell. Not just frozen food. Not just the metallic tang of raw meat. Something worse. Rotten. Decayed. Like something had been left in here for too long. A shape loomed at the far end, hidden in the shadows. I didn't want to see it, but I stepped closer. The floor was slick beneath my shoes. A dark stain trailed across the tiles. The closer I got, the more I could make it out. A person. No. People. They hung from the ceiling like slabs of beef, their uniforms frozen stiff, their faces pale and covered in frost. I knew those uniforms. Milton's 24-hour grocery. Their name tags were still attached. Isaac Green, Tom Willis, Maggie Lopez, all the people who had worked here before me, all the names from the book. I stumbled backward, my breath shattering into short, broken gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. I choked on a scream. One of them, one of the frozen bodies, was still alive. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. His eyes, wide and clouded with frost, locked onto mine. "Help!" His voice was brittle, breaking like ice. Then, behind me, a creak, the freezer door. It was closing. I spun, but it was too late. The woman stood in the doorway, her too wide mouth stretching into something almost pleased. "You're part of it now," she whispered. Then the door slammed shut, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the freezer whole, thick, heavy, the kind of darkness that seeps into your skin, that makes you feel like you're falling even when you're standing still. I threw myself against the door, hands scrambling for the handle. My fingers slipped on the ice-rimmed metal. I twisted, yanked, slammed my fists against it. Nothing. I was trapped. A thick gust of freezing air curled around my ankles. The temperature was plummeting fast. My breath came out in frantic, shivering puffs. Behind me, something moved. A shuffle, a crackle of frost, a quiet, rattling exhale. The frozen bodies. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But I felt them, hanging there, watching. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. Then, a whisper, soft, like a breath against my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." The cold burrowed deep into my bones. I clenched my teeth and forced myself to turn. The bodies were still there, hanging in neat, frozen rows. Ice clung to their faces, their hands, their stiff uniforms. Their eyes, clouded, lifeless, stared blankly ahead. All except one. The man who had grabbed me. Isaac Green. His fingers twitched. His lips moved, slow and sluggish, like his mouth could barely remember how to work. "Please." His breath came out in tiny ice crystals. "You have to stop it." I swallowed hard. My voice barely worked. "Stop what?" Isaac's body twitched violently. His eyes darted toward something over my shoulder, the freezer's back wall. I turned. There was a door, a second door, hidden in the shadows, rimmed with frost. I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe it hadn't even been there before. Isaac's voice cracked. "Don't let it happen again." My fingers curled into fists. I had two choices: stay here and freeze, or go deeper. I didn't let myself think. Thinking led to fear, and fear would root me in place. I stumbled toward the second door. My steps were slow, my shoes sliding against the ice-slicked floor. My body was already shaking, the cold biting into my skin like tiny needles. I reached for the handle. It burned. Not with heat, with something worse. A deep, aching cold, so sharp it felt like it was slicing through my palm. I gritted my teeth and yanked it open. The smell hit me first. Meat. Not the clean metallic scent of raw beef or poultry. This was different. Sour. Wrong. A narrow hallway stretched beyond the door, lined with rusted metal walls. Fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead, casting sickly yellow light. At the end of the hall, a sound. A slow, wet thump. Like something heavy being dragged. I should have turned back, but there was no turning back. I stepped forward. The floor was sticky beneath my shoes. I didn't want to think about why. The hallway stretched on forever. Every step I took, the walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier. Then I saw it. The cutting room. A massive industrial space. The ceiling was lined with hooks, hundreds of them, swinging slightly, even though there was no breeze. The tables were covered in, I gagged, meat, bones. Some pieces, too big to be anything but. No, I wasn't going to think about that. In the center of the room stood a butcher's block, dark with age, stained with something thick. And next to it, a man. No, not a man. A thing wearing the idea of a man. It was tall, dressed in an old blood-stained apron. Its skin was stretched too tight, its face hidden behind a metal mask, the kind you'd see in an old slaughterhouse. Rusted, bolted to its skull. In its hands, a cleaver. The thing raised its head. It had no eyes, just two hollow, gaping holes. And it saw me. The cleaver scraped against the block. Then, it took a step forward. The thing standing by the butcher's block. Tall, impossibly tall, its shoulders hunched forward like it had spent too much time in tight, airless spaces, tilted its head slightly, as if listening. The metal mask covering its face was rusted and pitted with age, bolted to its skull in a way that suggested it had never been meant to come off. Two hollow, gaping holes where its eyes should have been stared straight through me, and yet I felt them burrowing into my skin, peeling away layers of flesh and thought until it could see whatever was left of me underneath. Its hands, thick and unnaturally long, gripped the cleaver tightly, the blade chipped and stained with something dark that had dried and crusted over time. It took another step forward, the heavy, deliberate kind of step that didn't need to be fast because it had already decided that you had nowhere left to run. The walls of the cutting room seemed to breathe. The metal hooks lining the ceiling swayed slightly, clinking against each other, a soft, irregular rhythm, like wind chimes in a dead air space. The fluorescent bulbs overhead flickered, buzzing erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the blood-streaked floors. I took a step back. My foot slipped on something wet. The thing didn't react. It simply raised its free hand, the one that wasn't gripping the cleaver, and pointed at me. No words. No sound. Just the slow, deliberate extension of its fingers, each one too long, the nails thick and yellowed like they had grown unchecked for decades. A deep, guttural scrap of metal against wood filled the room as the cleaver dragged across the butcher's block. The thing took another step forward, and I took another step back, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently that I could feel it in my throat. I needed to run. I needed to move. But the air in the room felt thick, pressing against me from all sides, like I was wading through something invisible and heavy that wanted to keep me right where I was. The thing moved faster than it should have been able to, its entire frame lurching forward in a single jerking motion, closing the distance between us in the space of a single breath. I turned and bolted. My body finally listened to the screaming survival instinct buried deep in my gut, and I ran, shoving past metal carts stacked with trays of indistinguishable meat, my sneakers slipping against the slick floor as I careened toward the hallway I had come from. Behind me, I heard it move. Not footsteps, not the sound of heavy boots slamming against tile, but something worse. The sound of flesh dragging, of weight being pulled across the floor, of something old and rotting shifting itself forward without the use of legs. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door at the end of the hallway, the one leading back to the freezer, and grabbed the handle with both hands. My fingers were stiff with cold, numb, and shaking, but I twisted, pulled, yanked with everything I had left. The door didn't budge. The handle was ice cold, slick with frost that burned against my palm. But I didn't care. I wrenched at it again, teeth clenched so tightly my jaw ached, desperation clawing up my throat like bile. The sound behind me was getting closer. That slow, wet drag. The scrape of metal against the walls. The air around me was thick with the stench of raw meat, of something spoiled, something that had been left to fester far too long in the dark. A breath. Not mine. Hot, damp, wrong. Right against the back of my neck. I screamed. The door flew open. I fell forward, tumbling onto the frozen floor of the freezer, my hands slamming against the tile as I scrambled to my feet. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing the breath straight from my lungs, but I didn't care. I turned, reaching for the door, ready to slam it shut before whatever was behind me could follow. But the hallway was empty. No movement, no sound, just the long, rusted stretch of metal walls leading into darkness. The cutting room was gone. The butcher's block, the hooks, the smell, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it had. I could still hear it. The wet, dragging sound. Somewhere, nearby, waiting. I stepped back, my breath coming out in ragged, shuddering gasps, the frost clinging to my clothes, my skin, my bones. I turned and stopped. The frozen bodies, the ones hanging in neat rows along the freezer's back wall, were no longer still. Their heads had turned, all of them, facing me, their frozen, clouded eyes locked onto mine. And then, one by one, they started to smile. I don't know how long I stood there, my breath stuttering out in frantic little gasps, my body shaking from something far worse than the cold. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe a lifetime. All I knew was that the bodies hanging from the freezer's ceiling, employees who had come before me, their name tags frozen into the stiff fabric of their uniforms, were no longer just corpses. They were looking at me. Their heads had turned, stiff and unnatural, their necks cracking under the weight of ice and death, and on each of their frost-bitten faces was a smile. Not the kind that people wore when they were happy. Not even the forced, awkward grimace of a cashier pretending to care about a customer's bad jokes. This was different. Their lips had split open, wide and frozen. The skin stretched too thin over their teeth, as if something else inside them was forcing them to grin. Their eyes, clouded with frost, veins blackened beneath translucent lids, were locked onto mine. And even though I knew they couldn't see, I felt them watching me. Really watching me. A thick, unnatural silence filled the freezer, pressing against my ears, my lungs, my skull. The kind of silence that didn't belong in a place where things were still alive. Then, a breath. Not mine. One of the bodies, Isaac Green, the last name in the book, the last poor soul to work this job before me, twitched. His fingers, stiff with ice, curled slightly, his frozen knuckles cracking like splintering glass. His head tilted just a little further to one side, his frostbitten skin creaking under the weight of the movement, and for a split second, I thought I saw something shift beneath his uniform. Something inside him. Something that wasn't human. The others followed. One by one, they began to move. Not much, just the smallest twitch of a finger, the slow, bone-grinding tilt of a head, the creak of joints that had no right to function after being frozen solid. Their chests didn't rise. They weren't breathing, but they were moving. I stepped back. My foot slipped on the ice, my balance wavering, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. The bodies lurched forward, just an inch, just enough to let me know that whatever held them here wasn't done with them yet, wasn't done with me. A whisper, barely a sound, curled through the frozen air. "It's your turn now." It wasn't Isaac speaking. It wasn't any one of them. It was all of them. The words slid through their frozen lips in perfect, unnatural unison, their grins widening until I could hear the skin cracking, splitting at the edges. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my legs slipping on the frozen tiles, my fingers clawing at the freezer door handle before my brain could even process what I was doing. My hands burned from the ice-coated metal, but I didn't let go. I twisted, yanked, ripped at it like my life depended on it. Because it did. The door didn't move. The lock held firm. No, no, no. I turned, my breath coming in panicked, uneven bursts, my back slamming against the freezing metal, and I watched as the bodies took another slow, jerking step forward. They weren't hanging anymore. They had let go. Their frost-stiffened fingers twitched at their sides, their spines bent at unnatural angles, their heads still tilted, still watching me. Their grins were wider now, stretching further, exposing teeth rimmed with blackened gums, as if whatever had been inside them had been eating them from the inside out. Isaac was in front, his hands clenched into stiff frozen fists. His lips moved, the cracked skin breaking apart like shattered porcelain. We all start as customers. I choked on my breath. Then we become employees. The others echoed him, their voices blending into something hollow, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. And when we can't serve anymore, they took another step. We become the inventory. I screamed. The lights flickered. The freezer rumbled, a deep, groaning sound that came from the walls, the ceiling, the floors. The entire room shook around me. And then, just as the first frozen hand grabbed my wrist, the door slammed open behind me. A force yanked me backward, pulling me out of the freezer, sending me sprawling onto the stockroom floor. I gasped, my body still convulsing from the cold, my limbs numb, my lungs burning, and for a second, I couldn't tell if I was still dying or if I had already been dead this whole time. Then I looked up. Mr. Langley stood over me. His round face, always damp with sweat, was calm. His beady eyes stared down at me, not with concern, not with relief, but with something worse, something like disappointment. "You weren't supposed to see that," he muttered, shaking his head. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his sagging face like a tired father dealing with an unruly child. Then, with an almost casual tone, he said, "Guess we'll have to start over." He raised his hand, and before I could even scream, everything went black. I woke up gasping, my lungs heaving like I had been drowning just seconds before. The world around me was spinning, shifting in and out of focus, and for a moment, I had no idea where I was, who I was, or what had happened. My body felt wrong, cold, but not from the freezer. Heavier, like something was pressing down on me, keeping me still. Then, the memories crashed back all at once. The whispering bodies in the freezer, the frozen grinning faces, Isaac Green's lifeless eyes staring into mine, the thing wearing the butcher's mask, and Mr. Langley. I tried to move, to sit up, to push myself off the ground, but my limbs wouldn't obey me. They felt stiff, sluggish, like I was trapped in a body that wasn't fully mine anymore. Then I realized I wasn't on the ground at all. I was seated. I blinked, trying to focus. I was behind the checkout counter, slumped in my chair, my arms limp at my sides. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bathing the store in that same dull, lifeless glow as always. The aisles were clean, the shelves fully stocked, and the automatic doors, the ones that had refused to open for me the entire night, now slid open with a gentle hum as the sun rose outside. It was morning. I was still here, but something was wrong. My head throbbed, my thoughts sluggish, like I had been drugged or worse. My uniform was damp, the stiff red fabric clinging to my skin, and when I lifted my shaking hands to my face, a sharp, coppery scent filled my nose. Blood. Not just a drop. Not a smear. It was soaked into my sleeves, dried beneath my fingernails, thick and dark against my skin. I gagged, shoving my chair back so hard that it scraped against the floor, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I needed to get out. I had to get out. I turned toward the doors, my legs unsteady beneath me, my vision swimming. But just as I took a step forward, a voice. Calm. Casual. Like nothing had happened. Good work last night. I froze. Mr. Langley stood by the manager's office, straightening his tie like he was just starting his day. Like he hadn't. Knocked me unconscious and left me to die in the freezer. His round face was calm, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating, something old, something hungry. I opened my mouth, but my throat was raw, and nothing came out except a hoarse, broken sound. Mr. Langley smiled, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Takes a little getting used to, but you'll settle in just fine. He gestured toward the empty store, as if it were something normal, something safe. You made it through the first night. That's the hardest part. I shook my head. My skin felt tight, like it didn't quite fit right anymore. My chest was tight, my heart pounding. I need to go, I managed to croak. His smile didn't waver. Oh, no need for that. You're already here. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat almost unbearable. I turned toward the doors again. No, I said, my voice shaking, but stronger this time. I'm leaving. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight tilt of the head, a knowing glance toward the glass doors. Go on then. I hesitated. This was too easy, too simple. The doors had been locked all night. The phones had been dead. The freezer had tried to swallow me whole. And now, just like that, I could walk out? Still, I had to try. I staggered toward the doors, my legs unsteady beneath me, my fingers trembling as I reached out. The glass was cool under my palm. The sensors hummed, and the doors slid open. The outside world was right there. A parking lot bathed in the soft light of dawn. The scent of asphalt warming in the morning sun. The distant hum of traffic, of normal life. I took a step forward and froze. My reflection was staring back at me in the glass. But it wasn't me. The figure standing in the glass wore my uniform, my clothes. Its skin was pale, waxy, stretched too tight over its bones. Its hands, My hands were stained red, and its face. It wasn't smiling. It wasn't moving at all. It was watching. I took a step back, but the reflection didn't. It stayed perfectly still, frozen, like something waiting, like something trapped. A slow, creeping horror crawled up my spine. I turned back toward Mr. Langley, my mouth opening, my heart pounding. But he was already walking away. He stepped into his office, whistling a low, easy tune under his breath, and as the door swung shut behind him, I caught a glimpse of the wall behind his desk. Polaroids. Dozens of them. Each one showing a different employee in the same stiff red uniform, standing behind this very counter, staring blankly into the camera. Their eyes empty, their bodies rigid. And below each photo, in neat, perfect handwriting, a date. The date they started. No end date. Just like my name in the ledger. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't allowed to leave. Because I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was part of the inventory. And as the store's automatic doors slid shut again, locking me inside, I heard the familiar sound of a shopping cart squeaking softly in the distance. Aisle 7. A new customer had just arrived, and I smiled, just like I was supposed to. I'm going to tell you a story that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. It's about the night my parents came home early from their vacation. Except, they weren't my parents. Not really. And by the end of this, you'll understand why I can't sleep with the lights off anymore. It started like any other night. I was home alone, which wasn't unusual. My parents had gone on a week-long trip to some fancy resort, leaving me to fend for myself. I didn't mind. I was 17, old enough to handle a few days on my own. I had pizza, Netflix, and no one to tell me to clean my room. It was perfect. But then, last night, I heard the front door open. I froze on the couch, the remote still in my hand. My parents weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow. I listened as the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the familiar jingle of keys hitting the table by the door. My heart started to race. Maybe they'd changed their plans. Maybe they'd decided to come home early. "We're home!" my mom's voice called out. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Of course, it was them. Who else would it be? I got up from the couch and headed toward the kitchen, where I could hear them shuffling around, but something felt off. I can't explain it. Not really. It was like the air in the house had changed, like it was heavier somehow. And their voices, they sounded almost right, but not quite. Like when you hear a song you know, but the singer's voice is just a little too high or too low. It was subtle, but it was there. "Hey, kiddo," my dad said as I walked into the kitchen. He was standing by the fridge, his back to me. "How's it going?" Good," I said, forcing a smile. "I didn't know you guys were coming back early." "We decided to cut the trip short," my mom said, turning to face me. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We missed you too much." I nodded, trying to shake the weird feeling in my gut. They looked like my parents. They sounded like my parents. But something about the way they were standing, the way they were looking at me, it made my skin prickle. "You hungry?" my dad asked, pulling a container of leftovers from the fridge. "We brought some food back from the resort." "No, I'm good," I said quickly. "I already ate." "Suit yourself," he said, shrugging. He turned back to the fridge, and I took the opportunity to slip out of the kitchen and head upstairs to my room. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Why was I so freaked out? They were my parents. They'd come home early, that was all. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to distract myself by watching some TV. I grabbed my laptop and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. But as I scrolled through Netflix, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the way my mom had smiled at me, the way my dad's voice had sounded just a little too off. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of my door creaking open. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. My heart skipped a beat when I saw two figures standing in the doorway. "Mom? Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. They didn't say anything. They just stood there staring at me. And then slowly, they smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like their faces were stretching to fit it. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was frozen in place. All I could do was watch as they took a step closer, their eyes never leaving mine. "We just wanted to check on you," my mom said, her voice soft but somehow wrong. "Make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I managed to choke out. "I'm just really tired." They didn't move. They just kept smiling that awful smile, their eyes glinting in the dim light from the hallway. "Okay," my dad said finally. "We'll let you get some sleep." They turned and left, closing the door behind them. I waited until I heard their footsteps fade down the hallway before I let out a shaky breath. My whole body was trembling, and I felt like I was going to be sick. What the hell was going on? I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to every little sound in the house. Every creak, every rustle made my heart race. I kept expecting them to come back, to open the door and smile at me again with those two wide grins. But they didn't. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my window. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream. A really, really bad dream. But then I opened my closet to get dressed, and that's when I saw it. My mom's suitcase. It was sitting there, untouched. It was like it had been when they left. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. If they'd come home early, why hadn't they unpacked? Why was it still here, like they'd never even opened it? I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. It rang once, twice, and then she picked up. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice cheerful. "How's it going?" "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you?" "We're still at the hotel," she said, sounding confused. "We're coming home tomorrow, remember?" I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My throat tightened, and I couldn't breathe. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling. You came home last night." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No, honey," she said slowly. "We didn't come home. We're still here." I dropped the phone, my whole body going cold. If my parents were still at the hotel, then who had come home last night? And more importantly, who was in the house with me right now? I stood there in my room, staring at the phone on the floor. My mom's voice still echoed in my head. "We're still at the hotel. We're coming home tomorrow." But if that was true, then who had I been talking to last night? Who had smiled at me with those two wide grins? My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to run, to scream, to do something. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe my mom had gotten confused. Maybe they'd come home early and she'd forgotten. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't make sense. My mom wasn't the type to forget something like that. And besides, the suitcase was still in the closet, untouched. I had to figure out what was going on. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against it, listening for any sounds from the hallway. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I slowly turned the handle and peeked out. The hallway was empty, the only light coming from the window at the far end. I stepped out, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The house felt different during the day, but not in a good way. The sunlight streaming through the windows should have made everything feel normal, but instead, it just made the shadows seem darker, more menacing. I made my way downstairs, my heart racing with every step. The kitchen was empty, the leftovers from last night still sitting on the counter. I stared at them, my stomach churning. Had they really eaten that food? Or had they just pretended to? I needed to find out who, or what, was in the house with me. I started with the living room. Everything looked normal, but as I walked past the couch, I noticed something on the floor. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up and unfolded it, my hands shaking. It was a receipt from a gas station, dated yesterday, from a town over 200 miles away. My breath caught in my throat. If my parents were still at the hotel, then who had been driving their car? Who had been in the house last night? I crumpled the receipt in my hand and shoved it in my pocket. I needed to keep looking. I needed to find something, anything, that would explain what was going on. I checked the dining room, the bathroom, even the laundry room. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see them standing there, smiling at me with those awful grins, but they were nowhere to be found. I was about to give up when I heard it. A faint whisper, coming from the basement. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the whisper was coming from the darkness beyond it. It was too faint to make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to go down there. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made my way to the basement door. The whisper grew louder as I approached, but it was still too faint to understand. I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar steps leading down to the basement. But something was different. The air was colder, heavier, and there was a faint smell of something rotten. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whisper grew louder with every step, but it was still just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I shone the flashlight around the room. The basement was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, just like always. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. It was a mirror, an old, dusty mirror that I didn't remember ever seeing before. And as I stepped closer, I realized that the whisper was coming from it. I shone the flashlight on the mirror, and my heart stopped. Reflected in the glass wasn't my face. It was theirs. The things that had pretended to be my parents last night were staring back at me, their two wide smiles stretching across their faces. "We know you're awake," they whispered in unison. I dropped the flashlight and ran, my feet pounding against the stairs as I raced back up to the main floor. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, the door locked behind me. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, and tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no sense to be made. None of this was possible. None of this was real. But it was. And as I sat there, trembling in the darkness, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. They were coming. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like they were taking their time. Each one echoed through the house, growing louder as they got closer to my room. I pressed my back against the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was listen as the footsteps came closer and closer, and then they stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the doorknob. It didn't move. There was no sound, no indication that they were still there. But I knew they were. I could feel their presence, like a cold hand pressing against the door. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for something to happen. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All that mattered was the door, and the thing on the other side of it. Finally, I heard a soft knock. "Come downstairs," a voice whispered. It was my mom's voice, but it was wrong. Too soft, too sweet, like honey dripping from a knife. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was too tight, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. The knock came again, louder this time. "Come downstairs," the voice repeated. "We need to talk." I shook my head, even though I knew they couldn't see me. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Go away." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought they might have left. But then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh, like the sound of nails scraping against glass. "We know you're awake," the voice said. "We can hear your heart beating." I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. My whole body was trembling, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I looked around my room, searching for something, anything that could help me. My eyes landed on the window. It was on the second floor, but if I could just get to it, maybe I could climb out and run. I crawled across the floor, keeping as quiet as possible. The footsteps started again, moving away from my door and down the hallway. I didn't know where they were going, and I didn't care. All that mattered was getting out. I reached the window and fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. The cool night air rushed in, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I looked down at the ground below. It was a long drop, but I didn't have a choice. I had to jump. I swung my legs over the windowsill and hesitated for just a moment. Then I pushed myself off and fell. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I landed hard on the grass. Pain shot through my legs, but I didn't have time to think about it. I scrambled to my feet and started running, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from the house. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods behind our neighborhood. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. My legs were throbbing, and I could feel bruises forming where I'd hit the ground. But I was alive. I was out. I looked back at the house, my heart still racing. The lights were on in the living room, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. They were still there. They were waiting for me. I couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. But as I sat there trying to catch my breath, I realized something. I didn't have my phone. I had left it in my room when I jumped out the window. I had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know what was happening. I was alone. I stayed in the woods for what felt like hours, watching the house and trying to figure out what to do. The sun was starting to rise, casting a pale light over the neighborhood. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, I'd have to go back. But not yet. Not until I figured out what those things were and how to stop them. As the sun rose higher, I noticed something strange. The shadows in the house were gone. The lights were off. And everything was still. It was like they'd disappeared. I didn't trust it. I knew they were still there waiting for me, but I couldn't stay in the woods forever. I needed to get my phone. I needed to call for help. I crept back toward the house, my heart pounding with every step. The front door was still open, just like I'd left it. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The house was silent, too silent. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, but nothing else. I made my way upstairs, my eyes darting around every corner, expecting to see them at any moment, but they were gone. I reached my room and grabbed my phone, relief flooding through me. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On my bed was a mask. It was a simple white mask, like the kind you'd wear to a costume party. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It was too smooth, too perfect, like it had never been worn. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The mask was cold to the touch, and as I turned it over, I realized there was something written on the inside. "We'll be back." I dropped the mask and backed away, my heart racing. They were coming back. They weren't done with me. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached the safety of the woods. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. But as I sat there, clutching my phone, I realized something. I couldn't run forever. Eventually, I'd have to face them. And when I did, I'd be ready. I sat in the woods for what felt like hours, clutching my phone and trying to figure out what to do. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, I'd have to go back to the house, but the thought of facing those things again made my stomach churn. I needed help. I needed to tell someone what was going on, but who would believe me? I could already imagine the looks on their faces if I tried to explain. "Oh yeah, my parents came home early, but they're not really my parents. They're something else." They'd think I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I had to try. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my hands still shaking. I needed to call someone who would listen, someone who wouldn't just hang up on me. My eyes landed on my best friend, Jess. She'd always been there for me, no matter what. If anyone would believe me, it was her. I hit the call button and held the phone to my ear, my heart pounding as it rang. "Hey," Jess answered, her voice cheerful. "What's up?" "Jess," I said, my voice trembling. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's wrong? You sound freaked out." "I am," I said, my voice breaking. "Something's happening at my house. Something bad." "What do you mean?" Jess asked, her tone serious now. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "My parents came home early, but they're not my parents. They're something else, and they're after me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Jess trying to process what I'd just said. "Okay," she said finally. "Where are you now?" "I'm in the woods behind my house," I said, glancing around. "I ran out last night. I couldn't stay there." "Stay where you are," Jess said. "I'm coming to get you." "No," I said quickly. "You can't come here. It's not safe." "Then what do you want me to do?" Jess asked, her voice rising. "I can't just leave you out there." "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking. I need someone to believe me." "I believe you," Jess said firmly. "But you can't stay out there alone. Let me come get you, and we'll figure this out together." I hesitated, my mind racing. Jess was right. I couldn't stay in the woods forever. But the thought of going back to the house, of facing those things again, made my stomach churn. "Okay," I said finally. "But be careful, they're still in the house." "I will," Jess said. "Stay where you are. I'll be there as soon as I can." I hung up the phone and leaned back against a tree, trying to calm my racing heart. Jess was coming. She'd help me figure this out, but until she got here, I was on my own. I stayed in the woods, watching the house and waiting for Jess to arrive. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat was starting to get to me. My legs were still sore from the fall, and my throat was dry. I needed water, but I didn't dare go back to the house. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. I peeked out from behind a tree and saw Jess's car parked in front of the house. She got out and looked around, her eyes scanning the woods. "Over here," I whispered, waving my arm to get her attention. Jess saw me and hurried over, her face pale with worry. "Are you okay?" she asked, grabbing my arm. "You look terrible." "I'm fine," I said, though I knew I wasn't. "We need to get out of here. They're still in the house." "Who's still in the house?" Jess asked, her eyes wide. "Your parents?" "They're not my parents," I said, my voice trembling. "They're something else. I don't know what they are, but they're not human." Jess stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's get out of here." We hurried back to her car, and I climbed into the passenger seat, my heart still racing. Jess started the engine and pulled away from the curb, glancing back at the house as we drove away. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My house," Jess said. "You can stay there until we figure this out." I nodded, relief flooding through me. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back at the house, and my heart skipped a beat. They were standing in the window, watching us drive away, and they were smiling. Jess's house was a welcome relief after the nightmare of the last 24 hours. Her parents were out of town, so we had the place to ourselves. Jess made me a cup of tea and sat me down on the couch, her face full of concern. "Okay," she said, sitting across from me. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." I took a deep breath and told her everything. From the moment I heard the front door open, to the whispers in the basement, to the mask on my bed. Jess listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with every word. When I finished, she sat back, her eyes wide. "That's insane," she said finally. "But I believe you. We need to figure out what's going on." "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't even know what they are." "We'll start by doing some research," Jess said, pulling out her laptop. "Maybe we can find something online about whatever they are." We spent the next few hours scouring the internet for any information that might help us. But no matter what we searched, we couldn't find anything that matched what I'd experienced. It was like they didn't exist. "Maybe they're ghosts," Jess suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Or, I don't know, some kind of shapeshifters?" "I don't think so," I said, shaking my head. "They're not ghosts. They're something else." We were still searching when my phone buzzed. I picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. "We know where you are." My heart stopped. I showed the text to Jess, her eyes widening in fear. "They found us," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to call the police," Jess said, grabbing her phone. "This is too much." "No," I said quickly. "They won't believe us. They'll think we're crazy." "Then what do we do?" Jess asked, her voice rising. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us." "We fight," I said, my voice firm. "We find out what they are, and we stop them." Jess stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but how?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them win. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Jess found an old baseball bat in the garage, and I grabbed a kitchen knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the sun set, the tension in the house grew. We sat in the living room, the lights off, waiting for something to happen. Every creak, every rustle made us jump. But nothing did. Until the knock came. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a chill down my spine. "They're here," I whispered, my heart pounding. Jess grabbed the baseball bat, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" "We answer it," I said, standing up. "But we don't let them in." We crept to the front door, the knock coming again, louder this time. I peered through the peephole, my heart racing. They were standing on the porch, their two wide smiles stretching across their faces. Open the door, my mom's voice said, sweet and soft. We need to talk. No, I said, my voice trembling. Go away. There was a long silence, and then the door handle started to turn. They're coming in, Jess screamed, raising the bat. I grabbed the knife and stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, their eyes fixed on me. We know you're awake, they whispered in unison. We know you're scared. Stay back, I shouted, holding the knife out in front of me. I'm not afraid of you. They smiled, their grins stretching wider than ever. You should be. And then they lunged. I don't remember much of what happened next. It's all a blur of screams and blood and darkness. But I do remember one thing. We fought. Jess and I fought with everything we had. And in the end, we won. But it wasn't without cost. Jess was hurt, badly. I called 911 as soon as it was over, and they took her to the hospital. She's going to be okay, but it's going to take time. As for me, I'm not sure I'll ever be okay. Every time I close, in my eyes, I see their faces, their two wide smiles, their cold, empty eyes. I don't know what they were. I don't know where they came from. But I do know one thing. They're gone. At least, I think they are. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a whisper. And I wonder, are they really gone? Or are they just waiting? Waiting for me to let my guard down. Waiting for me to fall asleep. Waiting to come back. And when they do, I'll be ready. Because I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of the dark. I'm not afraid of the whispers. And I'm not afraid of them. Because I know the truth. They're not my parents. And they never will be.